American Nexus, the complete series, written and performed by Jacob Valentine. Book 1, President Troll. Be careful what you wish for, a common warning. Chapter 1, Misery. This was the worst day ever. How? James moaned, the mess of broken biofigures and scattered pencils rolling off the edges of his desk. I'm so sorry, bro, Charlie muttered, rubbing the back of his head and smiling. We were just having some fun. Yeah, I'll clean it all up for you, Mace chimed in, tossing aside the football they'd been throwing, which knocked over another set of figures with a crash. The three young men stared at the mess of plastic parts scattered across the dorm's hardwood floor. As Mace slowly reached for the nearest piece, James felt his composure shatter, just like his figures had. No, he said, pushing past Charlie and nearly knocking the guy's glasses off, swiping the plastic bits out from under Mace's fingers and into his hand. Dumping them onto his desk, James clenched the edges of the plywood as he struggled to control himself. Don't touch my stuff, please, James growled. Chill, bro, Mace said, standing up straight. Though he couldn't see it, James heard Charlie's smile melt as he opened his mouth. We didn't mean to hit anything, he muttered. Just please get out, James said back, struggling to hold back his growing frustration. Please. Aw, come on, man, Mace said, starting to walk over. Flinching, James held his breath. He knew exactly what would come next. The friendly shoulder grab, followed by the embarrassing bro hug. Charlie and Mace loved doing that to him, especially when he wasn't in the mood for social interaction, which was pretty much every day since getting to the UA. Hey, Mace, Charlie said, bringing James out of his stress-filled state of mind. Let's go see if anyone outside wants to throw the ball around. James knew what Charlie was doing, and for the first time since he'd gotten here, he was grateful for something one of his roommates had done. As Charlie steered Mace out of the bedroom, James listened as the door closed. A soft click came as the wood was shoved back into its frame, worn down from years of college students going in and out of this bedroom. Pushing against his desk, James walked over and began picking up the spare studs and tiny plastic bars that kept his figures together. The process wasn't quick, but with each part, he slowly began to reassemble the awesome robots and cute anime characters in their places atop nearby shelves. Twisting the head of a dinosaur hero, James felt his mind drift back to the days when everything was only a matter of finishing work so that he could come home and build. As usual, the thought of his life before all of this had started made his heart ache. Picking up the lost thief figure, he stared at its brightly colored hair and cartoonishly long staff secured to its back. He recalled that scene in the show when this character was reintroduced, having been left behind by the main cast for most of the third season. Why'd you force me to leave? The character had said, looking desperately at the main cast. Why couldn't I stay with you? These questions hung over James' mind, as he did his best to return his collection to the way it was before his roommates decided it was a good idea to play Madden IRL. Setting the final figure in place, James looked fondly at his little plastic army. Characters from across fiction looked back at him, some wielding swords, while others looked to be charging into battle. Even in this frozen state, their adventures all seemed like so much fun, despite the hardships and trials they faced. What he wouldn't give to have an adventure like that. Sitting back in his chair, he remembered the first figure his father had ever bought him. It had felt so strange then, seeing Dad come home with a brightly colored box from the mall. His father was such a straightforward and hard-working person, almost never smiling unless speaking of his youth in Japan. To go and buy something like these figures felt like a hidden order from Mom. That sounded just like her. James's mother had always supported him and his fixation with pop culture, but sometimes it felt like she was just trying to spend time with him. Not that she had much time to do so, taking every opportunity to lecture him on the history of America and how much it meant to her to be here. He remembered not caring all that much. Why should he? He'd never known anything besides living here. A noise from the other room caught his attention. It sounded like Charlie had convinced Mace to go outside, followed by the slamming of the front door behind them. Normally, such a loud noise would make James shiver, but in just under a couple of weeks, he'd gotten used to that at least. Every dorm has character, Charlie had joked with him the first time he'd brought it up. And our little slice has a door that screams every time you close it. Heaven? James scoffed to himself. This place sure didn't feel like any heaven he'd ever imagined. It didn't feel like the other place either, just somewhere in between, and he couldn't tell if that was better or worse. Everything just felt annoying, and James wanted out of it. Reaching into the top drawer of his desk, he felt the familiar leather-bound cover of his journal. Pulling it out, he quickly opened to page 17 and reread his escape plan. Step 1. Pack everything up overnight while Charlie and Mace are at a party. Step 2. Call a cab or something. Step 3. Get home. Step 4. James stared at the blank space beside step 4. Nothing came to him. Nothing sounded right for his escape plan. He knew how angry his parents would be if he turned up back home. Dad would shout at him for hours, going on and on about how much money it had cost them to get him here. Mom would probably cry the whole time before taking another opportunity to talk about how rare the chance to attend college was, and how he was giving up on his future by coming back. Shutting the journal, he felt pressure on his jaw as he grinded his teeth together. He couldn't go home. Not yet. Not until he'd finished this stupid program. Folding his arms, James slid them beneath the edge of the desk and let his head rest atop his notebook. A deep sigh left his nostrils as the sound of the fan above him almost put him to sleep. Anywhere, he thought, his heart beating in unison with the shaking of the overhead fan. Please let me be anywhere but here. Chapter 2. Anywhere. James awoke to a knock at the door. Groaning again, he dried the side of his mouth with his bare arm before pushing back on his chair. How could he have fallen asleep like that? He wasn't the kind to take naps. Mace, cut it out. James stopped as he heard a girl's voice. Anyone else might have assumed it to be someone dainty and sweet with a tone like that, but James knew the truth. Lilith was anything but that. I just want to see if he's okay, Mace said, shoving open the door and coming face to face with James. Oh, good, you're fine, he said, flashing the kind of smile that made James want to punch him in the face. Why wouldn't I be? Oh, no reason, Mace said awkwardly, looking over his shoulder before walking away. Well, we're going out to a party at Lincoln's place. You can carpool with us if you want. No thanks, James called, reaching out and getting ready to close the door. Slam! A hand smacked the other side of the door, stopping it before it could be sealed and making James jump. He let go of the door and stepped back, watching in shock as Lilith slowly slid into view. Her brown eyes flared with silent rage, as only half of her face was visible in the space between the door and its frame. You're coming with us, James, she hissed, her black hair like liquid shadows running off the top of her head. He hated the way she'd said his name, as though it was some kind of spell that would summon demons. Lilith, take it easy. Shut up, Mason, Lilith said, pointing right at James's face. Listen, pal, you need social interaction. You've been here over a week, right? She asked, though it wasn't really a question. Swallowing, James felt his arms tighten up. Yeah? Then you need to talk to people. Now come on, this'll be good for you, Lilith said, opening the door all the way before reaching down and grabbing his hand. As she did, James felt the sudden urge to curl up and die. Lil, leave him alone, Mace whined, still holding the front door open. Like you and Charlie have been doing, Lilith said, dragging James out of the bedroom, past Mace and to the front door. For a single frame of time, the two young men's eyes met. The look that passed between them was that of understanding. For a split second, James felt sorry for one of his roommates. Just for a second. That sucked. Opening the door to their dorm, James led Mace and Lilith over to the couch like a parent leading a toddler to their toys. A deep burp came from within Mace as he set the couple down, turning and covering his nose as Lilith laughed. Thanks, dude, Mace said, while his head rolled back onto the couch. James stepped back and watched as Lilith laughed again and casually punched her boyfriend's shoulder. My name's not Dude, you idiot. All James could do was sigh. They really are perfect for each other, he thought, disgusted with the new memories he'd made with his friends, namely them drinking at dinner and then drinking more at the party. Yeesh, someone's hammered, Charlie laughed as he stepped back into the room, ducking under the doorway because of his height. Your mom is hammered, Lilith said, resting her head on Mace's shoulder at an uncomfortable angle. Mace laughed and coughed at the same time as James stepped farther back. Hopefully, they would just pass out on the couch. Is that a Napoleon Dynamite reference? Charlie asked casually, getting something out of the fridge. I'm not waiting around to find out, James thought, spinning around and running for the bedroom. He slammed the door behind him as Mace and Lilith laughed again, this time followed by choking. James plugged his ears and ran into the closet. Those jerks, he thought, as he pulled the sliding doors shut and hid between Charlie's musky clothes. He heard sirens wail from the street outside as his roommates began to argue about something. Hearing their voices, all he could do was sink to his knees and pray the tears wouldn't come. It had never been about introducing him to new people or making new friends. They'd only taken him along so that he could drive them back. To them, he was slightly better than calling a cab. To them, he was just another tool. Tears began streaming down James's face as he slumped down against the wall. Listening to their rising voices in the other room. It seemed Charlie was arguing with Lilith over trying to stop Mace from running to the bathroom, all while Mace shouted that he had to pee. The more he listened, the more James wanted them all to shut up. He hated their voices. He hated being around them, but most of all, he hated how he felt. Taking a shaky breath, James let go of his head and pulled his knees up to his face, his flip-flops sliding across the carpeted floor. He steadied himself. Thoughts of Ultra Knight's legendary catchphrase coming to his mind. There's still people, James thought, wishing the tears would stop, and people need me. The line from the show hung over his head as he sat there, listening as Lilith quieted down, followed by Mace's hurried footsteps towards the bathroom. Needed him? Oh, please. There was no way anyone here actually needed him for anything beyond rides home. Then again, even with the disagreements they'd had, James knew that he was lucky to have guys like Charlie and Mace to live with. He'd heard horror stories on social media about psychos killing their roommates over little things like not taking out the trash. Despite their shortcomings, James couldn't imagine either of them doing anything like that. As the tears continued to flow and as his face stayed hotter than a pizza oven, James couldn't help but go back to feeling used. He and Charlie didn't drink, but Mace and Lilith did every other night. He tried warning Mace about how bad that would be for his kidneys, but Mace had always smiled and said he'd tell his kidneys to stop drinking so much. And even if Charlie didn't drink alcohol, he certainly drank his weight in Mountain's Flow, a popular drink that the fridge always seemed to have an endless supply of. It looked like carbonated pee, and he remembered it smelling like a plastic fork he'd thrown in a campfire when he was little. What was most frustrating was how well his roommates did in their studies, even though James couldn't recall ever seeing them actually study. They always seemed to have time to goof off, all while he was struggling to keep his head above a modest C in nearly every class. The more James tried to look for the good in his roommates, the more frustrated he became. Why couldn't they just leave him alone? Why'd they have to drag him out tonight? Why had he been forced to go to college in the first place? Why'd he have to live in a stupid country that required you to go if you wanted a good job? Most of all, why couldn't he just be sucked into another world like the main character of one of his favorite shows? If he could just live in some traditional fantasy land, then he could be bigger and stronger than anyone else, able to stand up to those around him without fear. He'd be a real hero for a change, not some glorified taxi driver. If he could be taken to another world, he would become strong enough that he wouldn't ever need to hide in the closet again. He could be unstoppable. James clenched his teeth again, remembering his last trip to the dentist. Don't grind your teeth anymore, Dr. Dwayne had said. It's a bad habit. Sure, not as bad as some people's habits around here. Eventually, the tears began to slow down. Little by little, he felt his face begin to cool as the voices died down in the other room. Soon, he could hear the TV being turned on as the theme of the sports channel filled the other room. Letting go of his legs, James leaned his head back against the wall. Ignoring the babbling about sports he didn't care about, he pictured what he'd do if he ever did end up in another world. His checklist of what to do automatically began to run through his mind as he forced himself to smile. First, he'd gather his resources and allies quickly. Next, he'd find a rare weapon of some kind, like a flaming sword with matching shield. Finally, he'd instantly travel to the main enemy's lair and slay the big bad guy when they were least expecting it. After that, he could settle down with the beautiful female companion that he would definitely have, and never worry about college or roommates or Charlie's smelly closet ever again. Minimal casualties, lots of incredible power, and it would be all about him. It was perfect. Going over his fantasy, doubt started to seep through the cracks in his plan. What if no one wanted to be his companion? Well, that would be all right. He could just solo it. What if he never found a rare and powerful weapon? No problem. A magic power then, or an ability that put him far above normal. Even if that didn't happen, he was smart and determined. He would figure something out. He had to figure something out. He was the only one who could win the day. Right? Was he, James Rita, really capable of being a hero at all? The thought perched itself on the tip of his mind. It didn't harm him nor cause him pain. Instead, it sat there, unmoving but loudly asking again and again. Would a true hero run and hide in his closet? Would a hero call the people trying to help him useless and annoying? Would a hero throw his hands in the air and complain that everything was just too hard? For the first time in his life, the answer wasn't so obvious. Imagining himself standing before his allies, fully decked up in shining armor and holding the coolest sword ever, James tried to imagine what a hero would say. "Friends?" James felt his voice crack. Clearing his throat, he restarted his speech, all while thanking heaven nobody else had heard that. "Friends, allies, you are here because I have summoned you," James began, wiping the sides of his eyes. "Each and every one of you has something to offer me, and I have used you to the best of my abilities. You're welcome for that." James stopped, realizing he sounded less like a heroic king and more like a villain. For crying out loud, why did this always happen to him? He didn't want to be the villain. He was the hero. He was there to save people, win the day, and get whatever girl with brightly colored hair happened to be there. Slouching down, James put his head in his hands. Maybe going to another world wasn't all it was cracked up to be. A gentle glow started to rise from around his feet. Looking down, he wondered if crying in the dark was bad for one's health. Sometimes he saw stars if he shut his eyes for too long. This had to be in the same category. The nasty hardwood only got brighter, illuminating the closet like a small flame spreading from paper to cardboard. Beneath him, the floor began to melt away, revealing a blue plane of existence that seemed to go on for miles beneath him. The smell of old paper and perfume hit his nostrils, overwhelming the stench of Charlie's old shoes. James was stunned, watching as the floor continued to get brighter and brighter, the light going from a golden white to a deep blue, followed by an outstanding red that filled the closet with a beautiful scarlet bloom. Standing up, James felt the air around him get warmer as random magazines and long-forgotten birthday cards started to float around him. His voice had left him, and even his breath fell short as he stared at the floating contents of the closet. Had he fallen asleep again? No, dreams felt fake. They felt like something that wouldn't last. This was very real, and he found himself wishing this serene moment would last 10,000 years longer. Suddenly, the ground opened up, and James found his voice again. Screaming, he plunged down through the blue into an endless void. The darkness never ended. Blinking as many times as he could, he felt the wind fill his clothes as the sound of his screams filled the space around him. He felt his consciousness fleeing as his eyes began to roll back into his head. Flash! The void opened. James felt himself begin to slow down as his breath returned to his body. Opening his eyes, he couldn't believe what had replaced the darkness. Thousands of screens gently floated past his face as he began to float through the blue void. White stars danced through the sky around him as red stripes zipped across the space below. On the screen closest to him, James saw men wearing Revolutionary War-era clothing, all gathered around a desk waiting to sign a document. The first man finished his signature and pointed at it, laughing. Another screen whizzed past, showing wars being fought and other documents being signed. Another featured a scene of cities being built, bookstores opening and closing, a weird-looking printing press being made, and explorers traveling across oceans and landscapes. It was just like that one channel that loved talking about aliens. James had only ever heard of these events in history books and during his mother's rants. Yet here it all was, floating around him in this bright red, white, and blue void. Until it all vanished, and James found himself standing on a shiny metal platform. Looking up, he came face to face with the most terrifying woman he'd ever seen. Welcome, Mr. President. Chapter 3. Mr. President? James had never screamed so loudly before in his life. Not when the T-Rex had eaten the lawyer on the toilet in that old dinosaur movie. Not when the final season of the live-action fantasy show about thrones had ended so terribly. Not even when he'd learned his parents were shipping him off to college without his Fist of Bros gaming chair. Nothing compared to this. The woman before him was hideous, her long nose reminding him of a gargoyle, while her purple overcoat and corresponding dress seemed to project, "I'm a horrible witch and I've come to eat your flesh," though she hadn't said anything like that yet. What was worse still were the eyes, a fleshy pink without any pupils, and red veins fading into the white nothingness of their middles. If James had to guess, he'd think the hag was blind. "Calm yourself," she said, her voice more manly than any woman he'd ever heard. James immediately shut up, covering his mouth with his hands. His mind whirled in a million different directions, wondering most of all if he'd gotten some twisted version of his wish. Oh no. Please, no. That couldn't be the case. Where were the beautiful and snarky goddesses? Where were the amazing magical creatures and rustic homes? Where were the digital swords and art? Gazing around the vast space, all he could see were arches and black brick stretching up to a giant red gem at the center of the ceiling. It shone in the darkness like a red flame, its edges looking strangely smooth instead of sharp cuts gems usually had. Within it, he could faintly make out what looked like the closet and all of Charlie's things scattered across the floor. "What?" he tried to say, moving his gaze back down to the woman. Despite being full of a zillion questions, no sound came out of his mouth. "I'll brief you after we get you to your office, sir," the woman croaked. Clearing her throat, she spun around and began walking down the metal stairs from the platform. Did she really expect him to follow her? Where? To her oven? He winced as something flaky fell on the top of his hair. Looking up while brushing it off, James noticed the red gem starting to turn gray, just like the back of the platform he was standing on. "Wait for me," James whispered, shaking horribly as he got up and staggered down the stairs. His flip-flops clapped against the bottoms of his feet as he tried to follow the woman. The clicks of her heels on the brick floor echoed around the summoning chamber as a chunk of red crystal fell through the dissolving platform, splashing into an ashy cloud as the two figures departed. Hallways, stretching as far as the eye could see, wove on before them. James followed the ugly woman down what looked like the longest one, passing by doors covered in symbols and oozing with foul-smelling liquid. "Ignore that," the woman said. "She's going to eat me," James thought, following her up a small flight of stairs and turning down another long hallway. She certainly had the mouth for it. Although, if fine dining was the goal, then why would she mention an office? Rubbing the side of his mouth, he clenched his teeth again as memories of shows and movies swirled around inside his skull like chopped fruit in a blender. He'd never watched anything where someone was summoned in such a dull yet formal manner. It felt like going to the DMV. "Miss?" James asked quietly, looking up from his trance and realizing the woman was now wearing a hat with green feathers. Her clipboard also displayed what looked like summoning charts from that book he'd read when he was younger, about a British boy who goes to school to become a wizard. "Please hold your questions until we arrive at our destination, sir." There she went again, calling him that. Hadn't she also called him Mr. President earlier? President of what, exactly? Cold sweat started running down his head as he imagined himself being walked over to one of the foul-smelling rooms and being sat down behind a desk. From there, he'd be given nothing but paperwork to do for the remainder of his days, just like Dad did in his job, but without the free soda and popcorn machines. It's like college, but worse, James thought, looking around for a way to escape. He could try and run back to the portal, but for what? It's not like he knew how to cast spells. Feeling his pocket, he groaned as he realized he must have left his phone back in Lilith's car again. Guess calling for help wasn't an option either. "Sir, if you don't stop panicking, your fear will draw out the oozes," the woman barked, keeping her pace steady and her gaze in front of her. James caught his breath in his throat. What on earth were oozes? Were they those black pools of liquid coming off the doors? What would they do if they got him? James imagined it wouldn't be like catching one of those pink blobs in that monster catching video game he'd played. No, it was definitely going to be more like that one horror movie about liquid slowly digesting people. How much further?" he asked, swallowing his terror and leaning around the woman's hat, trying to catch another glimpse of her face. "Until what, sir?" the woman asked, her voice a cross between a gurgle and the drunken moans from Mace and Lilith. "You said something about an office?" James asked, wiping the sweat off his face. As he spoke, the hallway lights turned black. Despite the walls becoming darker than night, James could still clearly see both himself and the woman before him. It was as though he was back in the black void he'd first fallen through, or in a room about to be ignited by digital maps of the night sky, like in every sci-fi movie ever. Slowly, the woman turned to face him, her awful pointed eyebrows and curved nose casting a shadow on the rest of her face. Suddenly, the room became lit, as though someone had flipped a switch. James gasped and realized where they were. Around him was an almost perfect copy of the Oval Office, surrounding him on all sides. It even had a teleprompter in the corner. On the walls were paintings of some of the men he'd seen back in the blue space, all between busts of American presidents and founding fathers, although something about them seemed off. Some of them wore what looked like science fiction armor, while others had animal skins wrapped around their necks like robes. One of them even had a hamster sitting proudly on the top of his head. Looking around, James saw 2 flags on either side of the giant desk, with wooden eagles carved out of the tops of the poles. Behind the desk stretched long, curved windows, revealing a beautiful grassy field, as well as streets made of brick and nearby buildings of fantastic Revolutionary-era structure. It truly felt like stepping into a painting at a museum, except for the dragons that were carved into the desk itself. The chair to the desk slid back, like the mirror did in that opera phantom play Charlie never shut up about. It stopped about 2 feet away from the desk, and as it did, the witch woman set down parchment and a feathered pen before stepping to the side and nodding. Though neither spoke, James knew what she wanted him to do. Not seeing any benefit in refusing, he stepped forward and sat down. Adjusting his position, he felt the back of the chair expanding around him. Before he knew it, it felt more comfortable to sit in than anything he'd ever felt before. "Please sign your name, Mr. President," the woman croaked. James looked down at the parchment she'd laid out before him. There were no lines to write on, no terms or conditions, like every time he downloaded a new game onto his phone. There wasn't even a date in the top right corner, which was heresy according to every school teacher he'd ever had. Print or cursive?" he asked nervously. Instead of an answer, the woman sighed and held the feathered pen closer to his face. Gazing at the yellow piece of parchment, James felt sweat trickle down his back. Reaching out and grabbing the pen, his knuckles turned white as his eyes desperately searched the paper for answers. None came to light. Ink dripped from the tip of the pen. It felt much heavier than any feather he'd ever held before. It was almost like holding a soldering iron, the black liquid disappearing on contact with the paper like water on a hot sidewalk. At this point, he wasn't sure if he was even in control of his own body anymore. Everything felt like it was going in slow motion, and his hand felt disconnected from everything else. Slowly extending his arm over the paper, he wondered what exactly he was signing. Something told him it wasn't just another terms and agreement form. Watching his hand move over the paper, James felt the room become warmer and more welcoming as the pen touched down, pinning the parchment to the desk. The cold sweat and anxiety began to fade as a new sensation began to fill his body. It was almost like the feeling of putting on clothes that were fresh from the dryer. Eagerly, he recalled the many times his mother had taught him and his siblings how to write their names in cursive. Stretching the pen across the paper, he signed his name in the biggest letters he could. If only Mom were here to see it, she surely would have only lectured him for 30 minutes rather than an hour on his capital R's. James Rita, the page now read in the largest signature he'd ever written. He heard the woman cough once and looked up to see her squinting at him, as though she didn't approve of his oversized name. Smirking, James added a fancy curl over the I and A, driving the witch to lurch forward and grab the pen. He watched her walk toward an empty picture frame hanging over the door they'd come in. Moving with surprising swiftness, James watched the witch begin to grow taller. Her hat disappeared completely, being replaced by long, jet black hair. Her form changed as well to something far less hideous, reminding him of the principal of his high school. Not young, but fit in an uncomfortable way. It almost reminded him of the head witch from that film about a boy being turned into a mouse. As the woman placed the paper he'd signed into the portrait, he noticed her fingers transforming from long, hairy tendrils into slender human appendages. At the exact same time, the portrait seemed to open in a most subtle manner, allowing the document to slide perfectly within it as the woman turned around, now more frightening to him than she had been before. "With this signature, Mr. Rita," the older, beautiful woman said in a voice that resembled Cruella de Vil, "you have accepted your position as the next president of these United States." "What?" "Excuse me?" James asked. "Under your leadership, the country can begin to unite once more. From this moment on, your cabinet will support you," the woman said, as two other persons began to materialize beside her. Two crystals broke against the floor into ash as the new arrivals looked James over. A stalwart-looking man and a cheerful-looking woman now stood beside the witch, both dressed up in what James's mother would call their Sunday best. The three adults before him bowed in unison as a sign appeared in the corner of the desk, bearing only the middle of James's signature, but in the form of a golden plaque. "Your administration is here to help you, sir," the former witch in the middle declared, her coat and dress turning a shade of royal purple as she stood up straight. "My name is Miss Houston, your Secretary of Defense," she said, giving him the smallest of nods. "My name is Mr. Russo," The man to her left coughed, leaning up like a butler from those British TV shows. I am the head of Homeland Security. Hiya, I'm Miss Pierce, the woman on the right said, tipping her head to the side and smiling. I'm your Attorney General. With that, couches and a coffee table appeared in the middle of the room. Music of a patriotic tone could be heard in the background, and James watched as two doors opposite the man and the cheerful lady opened up, revealing hallways full of people busy at work, carrying papers and talking on cell phones. I'm sure you have some questions for us, sir, Miss Houston said, her eyes changing to the color of her dress. I promise that all will be answered soon. Chapter 4. The White House. A whole day of meetings. From one room to the next, James found himself doing nothing but meeting people of every size and stature. A few minutes of speaking to these people here, awkwardly shaking someone's hand there, only to get up and walk to another room of the White House, as Miss Houston called it, and have a separate meeting there. Through it all, no one seemed that interested in him. All the people he met seemed more focused on their own tasks, only stopping while Miss Houston explained to them where he'd come from and what he was doing here. How she knew anything about him to begin with was still a mystery. Despite getting their names, James thought the three adults chauffeuring him around as more like walking cold cases than people. It was like three mannequins with painted faces that never changed were leading him through a dense liminal space. All he could tell about Miss Houston was that everyone else followed her lead. She would constantly mention that the summoning had been a success and that she had been grateful to serve her country, all while occasionally glancing in his direction, as if making sure he didn't contradict her. As for Mr. Russo, James had no idea what he was about. He seemed to fit the archetype of the tall, dark, and gloomy man to a perfect degree, only speaking when spoken to and maintaining a position behind him at the back of the group. Then there was Mrs. Pierce. The oddly cheerful one with a reddish golden hair was always smiling at him like someone who didn't understand what you were saying but didn't want to let you know. James watched her occasionally interrupt Miss Houston before pulling him over, showing him off to these strangers in suits and ties as though he were a foreign little brother. For what it was worth, he didn't get the impression that any of them disliked him. It was all formal, all business, and nothing personal, just like every 80s businessman from every movie ever. Thankfully, through all the parading and confusing introductions, he was able to pick up on a few details about this new world. From what Miss Houston mentioned, he confirmed this was some kind of alternate United States of America, though the differences were startling. For starters, there was a lot of eagle and dragon imagery, usually depicting them fighting one another in the many portraits and paintings scattered across the hallways and in different meeting rooms. There were scenes of men in uniforms from different eras battling dragons in particular, sometimes slaying them, and in a few select images, riding them. He guessed these were predecessors of his, as they all had the same eagle fighting alongside them, or in the background of each portrait. He also noticed that each previous leader was never fighting alone. There were tanks and planes, great ships on the oceans, and legions of soldiers fighting side by side with them. It made James shiver, bringing back uncomfortable memories of that time he'd looked into that tabletop game series about giant space marines fighting demons and aliens alike. If he remembered one thing about it, it was that the game featured a high mortality rate. Hopefully, no matter what happened here, he wouldn't have to fight in any wars anytime soon. He certainly didn't feel qualified, especially when magic was a factor. Another detail he'd picked up on from Miss Houston was that he wasn't formally sworn in yet. Every conversation he was a part of, Miss Houston would inform the opposing person that he'll be sworn in on the 4th, or that we'll make it official on Independence Day. James remembered seeing the president back home during his swearing-in ceremony, placing his hand on a Bible and reciting whatever the man in front of him had said. He wondered if he'd get to do all that, or if it'd be some sort of weird spell book instead. That was perhaps the most striking detail about this new place. The casual magic. James would sometimes see someone snap their fingers as bits of electricity would roll off them. Other times, two people would be talking and they would snap their fingers in front of their glasses, instantly cleaning them. More than once, he noticed picture frames around the White House adjust themselves as if they were stretching out their beautiful golden rings and floral patterns as they proudly displayed moments of war and peacetime. How did it all tie together, he wondered? Was magic the only real difference between this world and the one he'd come from? And why was he chosen to come here? That had to be the biggest question on his mind as he, Miss Houston, and the other two continued their journey across the expansive White House. Finally, after what felt like days of getting introduced and paraded around, Miss Houston led them back into the Oval Office. Without caring what Miss Houston or any of the others did, James walked right back over to the desk and pulled the chair back. The familiar warmth started to flow back in, but James shook it away, leaning against the desk and pointing right at the woman in purple. "All right, spill it," James said, his voice cracking. Miss Houston turned and looked at him, squinting as she held her clipboard with her left arm. "Spill what, sir?" She didn't ask it as much as she sighed it, as if she had been dreading this all day. "Everything. I want to know everything," James said, standing back up and pointing from Miss Houston down to Mrs. Pierce. "Who are you people? Why did you bring me here? What is this place? Why are there eagles fighting dragons? Weren't you a witch earlier?" The two doors slammed shut loudly as Miss Houston snapped her fingers. It cracked through the air like a bone splintering against the asphalt. "Do not call me that again, young man," Miss Houston said, her tone lower than it already was. She began stalking forward, slowly turning her fingers towards him in a threatening manner. James clenched his teeth and stood back up, pushing the chair back all the way this time. At this point, he was too overwhelmed to be intimidated. "What's the matter with calling you a witch, huh? Aren't I the president now or something?" he challenged. "You won't be sworn into office until Friday," Miss Houston hissed, stepping right up to the desk and pointing over it at his head. "And at this rate, you won't even make it to dinner." "Aw, that'd be a shame," Mrs. Pierce chimed in, jumping over the back of one of the couches and bouncing on the soft cushion. "Dinner's always really good, especially when they have meat platters." James noticed Mrs. Pierce's eyes suddenly turned red as she rubbed her hands together, like a horrible swamp creature looking for its precious ring. He wondered if any of these people were actual people at all. Then again, the only inhuman thing Mr. Russo had done was make direct eye contact with everyone without blinking once. James wondered if it were possible to someday learn this power. Mr. Russo suddenly chimed in. "We should answer his questions now, Miss Houston, while we have time," he said, adjusting the collar of his suit like a secret agent getting ready for the sneak attack. "I couldn't agree more, Mr. Russo," Miss Houston said, lowering her finger and turning to look at the man in blue. "Will you please do the honors? I need to make a call." James watched a look pass between the two of them, like the stare between two individuals playing Russian roulette. Was it understanding? Was it determination? Or had someone passed gas and just refused to own up to it? After a small moment, where the only sound that could be heard was Mrs. Pierce's muttering about meat for dinner, Mr. Russo stepped forward and walked right past Miss Houston. Meanwhile, the lady in purple pulled a cell phone out of her pocket and began pressing buttons. James couldn't tell who had won and who had lost. "Sir," Mr. Russo said, standing before the desk as James felt his shirt growing damp with his own sweat. "Will you repeat your questions again for me?" James felt his mind go blank. He'd already forgotten what he'd wanted to know. Maybe it was the strong scent of vanilla coming from this man. Or maybe it was the way his eyes seemed to punch holes straight through James's skull like the yellow ninja from that one arcade cabinet his younger brothers always wanted to play. Whatever the case may have been, James felt like his brain had been sucked out of his head by a giant nasty worm. Where... me?" James asked lamely. He felt his cheeks getting hot as Mr. Russo sighed, leaning back and rubbing the space between his sharp eyes. "Perhaps it would be easier for you if I explained the requirements of your position," Mr. Russo said, sounding like some of the classmates James remembered from campus debates. He didn't remember anything ever getting resolved by any of them, but he did recall how quickly they were to dismiss whatever their opponent was saying. Once you are sworn in as the 45th President of these United States, you will be charged with 3 primary tasks that you, and only you, may complete on behalf of the American people, Mr. Russo said, as if he'd explained the same thing a million times before. The first is declaring a state of emergency. Some examples include major floods, massive rioting, and mushroom invasions. James perked up at the last example. Mushrooms do what? The second responsibility, Mr. Russo said, before James could even finish opening his mouth, is finalizing all laws into effect. You have the power to veto a law you find to not be in the best interest of the people. However, you can rest assured knowing your cabinet, as well as the majority of Congress, will have personally looked into each law before it appears on your desk. James nodded, remembering that was kind of like what happened back in his world. No, he thought, shaking his head. Not his world, the real world. He still wasn't convinced any of this was real. The third, and arguably most important sole responsibility you will carry regards dragons, Mr. Russo said, exhaling as if he'd concluded some kind of presentation. Should any such creature be spotted, you are tasked with slaying them. That is all. James was stunned. He sat back down, his butt landing in his chair with a thud. It felt just as comfortable as before, but slightly firmer. It was as though reality was making everything harder for him to sit on. I'm sorry, James said, focusing back on Mr. Russo. Did you say something about dragons? As in the big, scary lizards that breathe fire? A shrieking laughter came from the couch as Mrs. Pierce held her sides, nearly rolling off the edge of the couch. James looked confused and thought he saw even Miss Houston chuckle slightly, her cell phone still pressed against her ear. For simplicity's sake, Mr. Russo said, clearing his throat. Yes, sir. That is generally what I mean when I say dragons. Thoughts of the journey so far rolled through James's mind. Had all those portraits been real? Was he meant to slay dragons? These people were insane if they thought James could do so much as hold a gun properly. Is that a common problem around here? James asked, feeling dumb for asking. Shouldn't there be some sort of owner's manual or something that came with this territory? Thankfully, sir, it's not, Mr. Russo said, the shrieks of Mrs. Pierce's laughter fading away as she wiped the sides of her eyes with her hand, smearing her eyeliner before snapping and having it magically return back to normal. In fact, the last time the American people were threatened by a physical dragon was during President Ronald's time, several terms ago. We'd like to keep it that way, sir, Miss Houston said, closing her cell phone and walking right back up to the desk. Did she even take a call? James wondered as he watched glasses appear over her pointed nose. Do try everything in your power not to summon a new one, if you please, she said, staring right over her glasses into James's soul. Yes, ma'am, James said, not sure what she meant, and not sure if he wanted to find out. According to my schedule, we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Then we're off to visit the seat of Congress, Miss Houston said, looking briefly at a clock on the wall that James hadn't even noticed was there. Was there something else you wanted to know, sir? This time, the sir sounded more like a slur and less like a title. James gulped, praying to know what the right thing to ask was. How did you summon me? He asked, remembering that the easiest way to get someone to talk was to ask them about themselves. It seemed to work, as Miss Houston eyed him suspiciously. James found the strength to stare back, hoping the silence would defeat her, if not his words. Clearing her throat, Miss Houston pushed a stray strand of her hair back over her ear and began to answer. We used the sacred summoning ritual, created by the founders for this very reason, she said, her tone suddenly more reverent. What reason is that? James asked, each answer just leading him to another set of questions. Is that your final inquiry? Miss Houston asked, sounding more like a challenge. Yes, James said before he could stop himself. He shut his eyes and cursed his pent-up frustration. Miss Houston sighed and carefully pointed behind her at one of the many portraits on the wall, one which James swore hadn't been there when they all came in. The portrait depicted 4 rows of men, with each row having 10 men shoulder to shoulder. They were all dressed from different eras of history, some wearing stockings and wigs, while others wore suits and carried canes. James squinted and noticed that every man depicted had an interesting patch on their coats, which looked a lot like the American flag. Every president of this nation has hailed from an alternate world, Miss Houston declared. Your world was next on the list, and you were selected not because of who you are now, Mr. Ida, but because of who you can become. Every single man to occupy this office has brought unique personal experiences, depending on their homeworld. According to what I've seen of your life, what little of it you've lived, she paused, looking him up and down. You are what we need right now. Miss Houston stopped talking as James passed his gaze over each individual man in that portrait. All from their own worlds? Some of them could be considered doppelgangers of the presidents of his world. Now then, sir, if you'd be so kind as to join us, we have much work to do before you are sworn in. James swallowed again, not feeling much better. This place was serious, more serious than he'd thought, and the 3 responsibilities Mr. Russo had brought up began to weigh heavily on his mind. Sure, it was nice hearing that he had potential, but to the point that he could lead an entire nation, even slay dragons? At that very moment, a distant voice began to chuckle in the back of his mind. This'll be our final stop for the day, sir, Mr. Russo calmly reported as they approached the elevator. We will introduce you to your private detail, and then you will be shown to your quarters. James had never been so happy to hear the word quarters before. As the elevator doors opened and the 4 of them stepped inside, he felt shivers going down his spine as he wondered about who this private detail could possibly be. In a world of dragons, magic, and somehow the internet, it had to be someone fantasy-themed. A glimmer of hope filled his chest as he wondered if this world had techno knights like the one from the show I ate a cucumber in another world and now I have superpowered armor to go with my cheap abilities. Or perhaps he'd get some kind of space marines surrounding him everywhere he went. Or maybe, if things really worked out in his favor, he'd be assigned someone cute that he could form an attachment with. Suddenly, the idea of being at the top didn't sound so boring after all. Before he could finish imagining what this imaginary and cute person might look like, the elevator doors opened back up. Miss Houston and Mrs. Pierce stepped out into the giant hallway. The sounds of radios and typing echoed around the crammed walkways and cubicles. Seriously? James thought. He followed Mr. Russo past Miss Houston and Mrs. Pierce, remembering that Mr. Russo was supposedly the Secretary of Security or something. Seemed appropriate that he introduce him to his new bodyguards. Sir, this is Maurice and Cole, Mr. Russo said, pointing to 2 large men in suits walking towards them. James swallowed his disappointment. So much for a cute anime sidekick. Afternoon, sir, the bald one on the left said, looking over his sunglasses at James with his gorgeous blue eyes. It'll be an honor, Mr. President, the one on the right said, his mustache twitching as he spoke, almost completely covering his mouth. The honor's all mine, James said, unsure which one was which. As he did, the bald man with the sunglasses looked from him to Mr. Russo and began whispering something. 2 days tops, Maurice, Mr. Russo responded plainly. So Maurice is the bald one, James thought, looking at the guard with the mustache. Shall we go then? Cole asked. All James could think to do was gulp and look around. Huh? Oh, yeah, sure. Let's go. Despite his tone, both Maurice and Cole saluted him and stood at the ready. The air of awkwardness vanished, replaced with a sudden sense of security. Staring at the men's black suits, James almost didn't notice Mr. Russo walking back towards the elevator, stopping briefly to whisper something in Miss Houston's ear. Following him back, he expected to hear heavy footsteps from the large men behind him. Instead, all he could hear were the occasional whispers from people nearby. Could this day get any more bizarre? James thought. Stepping back into the elevator, he watched his new bodyguards stand on either side of him, blocking his view of Mrs. Pierce, who snickered. Where to now? James asked, ignoring her. Mr. Russo looked at him coldly, hardly making a sound as he removed a phone from his pocket and unlocked it with a fingerprint. After staring at the screen for a few moments, James watched him close the phone and face forward again. Maurice and Cole will take you to the president's quarters, and we'll reconvene tomorrow, Mr. Russo said. James looked at the ground in front of him, his mind racing as he wondered what this was all about. As he did, a single drop of sweat fell from Mr. Russo's head. Chapter 5. The War Room. Pushing on his back, James yawned and felt his vertebrae pop like candy rocks. Gentle white light filled the space around him, casting sharp shadows against the floor from large potted plants, a few side desks, and his giant new bed. Clenching his teeth, he recalled the first couple of days at college, and how it had taken a few nights to get used to sleeping on a mattress other students had used before him. Thankfully, his new bed had been nothing like that. The president's quarters in the White House were far above anything he'd seen at the AU. It had been soft enough that he didn't remember struggling to fall asleep, yet firm enough that he hadn't moved an inch. The sheets also remained nice and cool, to the point where he felt confident that he could fall asleep in a full suit and not overheat. It was like magic, he thought sarcastically as he walked into the giant bathroom. The lights instantly turned on, revealing his sleep-deprived face in all its glory. "The President of these United States, everyone," came the voice in the back of his mind. Bad breath, ruffled hair, and what looked like peach fuzz under his chin all reminded James of how unprepared he was here. For a terrifying moment, he wondered if this world even had razors and toothbrushes. Looking at the sink, he noticed a glass cup containing a brand new toother brush, according to its label. As he looked over his new toiletries, he noticed someone in the mirror behind him. Shouting and spinning around, James stared in horror at Maurice and Cole, both standing at attention with their hands behind their backs. Have these guys been watching me sleep? James thought helplessly. He imagined Cole twirling his mustache while Maurice hummed a song to himself about wearing his sunglasses at night, all while he snored. "Is there a problem, sir?" Maurice asked, getting down from his tactical position standing on top of the toilet. No, there's no problem," James said quickly, his voice cracking as he watched Cole step out of the walk-in shower. "I just didn't see." Trailing off, he watched the two men look at one another, their expressions that of seriousness and focus. After a moment of silence, they both turned to look at him again. "Didn't see what, sir?" Maurice asked. James said, trying to figure out the best way to ask them to leave. "Will you guys please, Yes, sir?" Cole asked, his voice reminding James more and more of that southern guy on TV who tried to get everyone to buy buckets of chicken. "I'd like to shower if that's all right with you," James said, hoping that would do the trick. Unfortunately, neither of the well-dressed men did anything. Continuing to stand still, James couldn't tell if they were looking at him or at their own reflections in the massive mirror behind him. "Would you like assistance with that, sir?" Cole responded. James felt his temperature drop. These guys are insane, he thought as he looked over Cole's shoulder and into the walk-in shower where a variety of soaps sat behind a glass door. An image started to form in his mind, one of the two men in suits grabbing towels and spinning them around before snapping them like whips against his backside when he wasn't looking. It would be just like high school all over again. No, please, no, James said, shaking his head and hands. "I'd rather you both stood outside the bathroom, please," holding his breath, awaiting their response. Instead, an awkward air of silence hung in the air as Maurice and Cole looked at one another, then back at him. Is that a no? He thought, as he slowly reached for his new toother brush and carefully removed it from its plastic pack. Turning to face his own reflection, he wet his toother brush and started scrubbing his teeth, staring at the two giants stationed carefully behind him. After a minute or two, he leaned down and spit into the sink, hoping against hope that when he looked back up, they would both be gone. Instead, upon cleaning out his mouth and wiping his face clean, he looked back into the mirror and saw the two men still at the ready behind him. Cole was holding a hand over his earpiece while Maurice quickly checked a cell phone he produced from his pocket. In the reflection of his sunglasses, James saw words "Trolls confirmed" in a news headline. Both bodyguards stared at one another again. This time, a look of worry ran between them. Maybe I'll just shower later, James thought. Good morning, soon-to-be official, Mr. President, Mrs. Pierce said cheerfully, coming into the office behind the rest of James's cabinet. Dressed in a white blazer with green pants and an orange undershirt, she looked like some kind of pumpkin scientist with her curly hair spun up neatly around her head. Her clipboard seemed to be holding on for dear life as she casually checked the pages, adjusting her glasses and never dropping her smile. Where's Russo? James grumbled, resting his head on the presidential desk. The wood wasn't comfortable, but it smelled like a forest grove mixed with fresh paperwork. Better than Charlie's closet. The head of Homeland Security is dealing with other issues today, Miss Houston said, appearing in the corner of the room. Is that what they see me as? An issue? James wondered, rubbing his freshly combed hair. He recalled trying to wear the same clothing he'd been summoned in, but Maurice and Cole had strongly disagreed with his poor college student appearance. James felt the collar of his new shirt and tie start to feel very uncomfortable and snapped his head up quickly, causing Miss Houston to slightly jump. That gave him some degree of pleasure, seeing her glare at him over her purple glasses as she recomposed herself. For just a moment, he thought he heard Mrs. Pierce start to giggle behind him. Today, Miss Houston began, we need to prepare your acceptance speech for after the ceremony. She quickly laid out some sheets of paper across the desk. James pulled back his arms as the older woman didn't seem to care that he was there. Here are some examples of what you can say, based on the world you come from, Miss Houston said, finishing and stepping back from the desk as a call came in over her phone. As she turned away to take it, James looked over the pre-made speeches before him. Immediately, he noticed something about each of them. Do I have to pick one of these? James asked, pointing at the one closest to him. It said something about standing up against rioters and evil, while the one next to it mentioned all people, including mermaids, elves, and dwarves, all being created equal. Hold on a second. Elves and dwarves are real? James asked, looking up. For a moment, it seemed to him like Miss Houston's entire body was shaded from the natural light of the room, with only the outlines of her glasses distinct on her figure. If you feel you can come up with something more inspirational, then please, make it known, she challenged. Well, that's intense. How much time do I have? James asked. No time at all, Miss Houston responded, putting her phone away. Oh, James said, looking down at the papers. He remembered a time back home when his parents had made it clear they weren't going to let him skip out on attending a college or a university. They'd printed out various forms for him to sign and told him to pick the ones that seemed the most appealing. Picking up one of the pre-written speeches, James saw the words America and Land of the Free, Home of the Many. That sounded good, but the one next to it mentioned the founders and something about dragons. An idea suddenly came to his mind, one that caused the edges of his mouth to curl up in a smug smile. This'll be interesting, he thought as he scooped all the papers up and stood up from his desk. I would like to take parts of each one and put them into my own speech, he said triumphantly. An awkward silence fell over the room. James kept the smile on his face as he felt Miss Houston slowly take the papers from his hands. A single cough came from Mrs. Pierce's direction as James opened his eyes. Neither one of them seemed to be laughing. Mrs. Pierce even went so far as to give him a thumbs down behind Mrs. Houston's back. Well, I'm sure we can arrange some sort of collaboration between the ghostwriters, Miss Houston said grimly, which didn't give James the satisfaction he'd wanted. It felt like he just declared everyone in the office would be required to work on a holiday. Time to change the subject. What's next on the to-do list? James asked, wishing the day were already over. Miss Houston cleared her throat and walked over to one of the two hidden doors, waiting patiently as it opened while Mrs. Pierce pulled herself up, brushing her red hair out of the way before smiling at him and putting one hand on her hip. We can visit the war room if you want, she said, her cheerful demeanor making James wonder what was keeping this woman going. Sure, James had no idea what good visiting the war room would do, but if it got them further away from the speech debacle, then by all means. At least it wasn't more paperwork to fill out. As the three entered the elevator behind the hidden door, he wondered if they'd been forging his signature on anything. That would make sense, he thought, and it would explain the look Miss Houston had given him after he'd first written it out. The signature of that size would be irritating to copy over and over again. They could at least ask permission first, he thought, as the elevator music played above them. Everything all right, sir? Maurice said, making James jump again. He spun around and saw his two bodyguards standing silently behind him, looking down as he could hear someone speaking through their earpieces. Yeesh, all good, James said, straightening his tie as it felt like it was choking him out again. These two were definitely not in here a moment ago. As the door closed and the elevator began to move down, James remembered a question he'd come up with this morning. No time like the present. Miss Houston? He asked. What is it, sir? The woman in purple responded, colder than a popsicle pulled straight from the freezer. Is there a vice president? As in someone who's second in command or whatever? He asked, not meaning to sound irritating. He half expected Pierce to start laughing again, but strangely, not a peep came from the more cheerful of the two women. Yes, sir, there is, Miss Houston said slowly. What's his name? James asked, feeling the steady movement of the elevator push up against his feet. It was like a dumbed-down version of a roller coaster going down a drop. A moment of silence came and went. James looked expectantly from the two women to his bodyguards, but none of them spoke. Mrs. Pierce looked at the ground, her eyes flashing red as Miss Houston kept her gaze on the elevator doors. Okay, then. When can I meet him? James asked, wondering if the vice president would also be someone summoned from another world. More quietness followed, and James felt his heart begin to race. What secret were they keeping from him? Is that a need-to-know kind of thing, or... Welcome to the war room, Mrs. Pierce said, spinning around cheerfully as the elevator doors opened, revealing the most amazing thing James had ever seen. Before them stretched a seemingly endless underground rocky canyon, full of massive square hangars cut into the walls. Each one held different environments within, like large dioramas of islands, icy wastelands, and dusty deserts. A complex spiderweb of railing and tracks, all holding workers, security officers, and goblin-looking creatures, carrying the coolest robot parts and pieces he had ever seen, connected each cave together. Everything came together at the center of the canyon, where a giant suspended building labeled War Room hung freely. Walking out onto the railing, James couldn't decide where to look. Gazing up, he saw the rocky walls stretching into a tiny white circle far above. The railing and walkways mixed with lights and magnificent hangars and smaller rooms, stretching for what must have been miles in every direction. Just looking around made James's head ache. You want to know the best part? Mrs. Pierce said cheerfully, grabbing James's arm and making him blush. He felt Maurice and Cole standing behind them, no doubt ensuring he didn't jump or fall or something. Have a look inside, Mrs. Pierce sang, smiling bigger than James had ever seen her smile before as she pointed at the closest glacier cavern. Taking a closer look, James noticed a large and out-of-place icicle block at the center of one of the snow rooms. Tilting his head to the side, he thought he saw it start to move like it was stretching. Suddenly, it got up. No way. Gasping, he watched as the ice block shook snow off its shoulders, its body perfectly camouflaged against the white and blues of its frozen home. Its head resembled those gun-something suits his friend Adrian back home was always building model kits of. From its back, ice wings extended and glowed with yellow light as the giant creature turned and faced them. After a moment, it slowly nodded in their direction. James could not believe his eyes. Is that a robot? He whispered. Better, Mrs. Pierce said, leaning against the railing. They're iron golems, or IGs. What are they for? He asked, noticing stone structures and bits of ocean rock also starting to move within their respective caves. Commander-in-Chief on deck! A masculine voice cried over the loudspeakers around them. Each environmental hangar seemed to move as perfectly camouflaged robots emerged from their biomes, walking to the edges and peering out, saluting as workers and goblin creatures alike stopped and stood at attention. These great biomachines are just some of the measures that help keep Washington, D.C. safe, Miss Houston said, walking up behind them. And they're only the beginning of today's visits, the Purple Witch said. Wait, seriously? James asked, looking from Miss Houston to Mrs. Pierce. Can I drive one? The red-haired woman laughed. Only if there's a serious emergency, she joked. Chapter 6. A Serious Emergency. There had never been a more epic day in James's entire life. Settling down for the night, freshly washed and snug beneath the covers, he fondly recalled all the events of the day as many times as possible. Each moment was so fantastic, so full of adventure and wonder and excitement, he'd hardly even noticed Maurice and Cole watching him through the mirror as he'd showered and hung up his new clothes. Lying there on his new bed, his smile refused to leave his face. Finally, after what had felt like days, he'd been shown something that made him feel like he really was in another world. He wondered when he'd get to see the Cat People Center again, or the Hall of Victories Past with its living statues, or the Memorial of Washington I with its taxidermy dragon towering over the front doors. Not even the most wonderful science museum could top this, he thought as he rolled over onto his side. Shutting his eyes, not even the strange voice in the back of his mind was enough to get him to lose his smile. Only then did he remember the one thing that had not been pleasant. Thinking back to the beginning of the day, James wondered what the deal was with the vice president. He hadn't given it too much thought then, but even with all the amazing techno-magical stuff he'd seen today, he couldn't help but wonder about this mysterious second-in-command. His mind began to race as this latest mystery began to take off. Was it someone he'd already met? No, he was sure he would have remembered if Miss Houston or Mr. Russo had introduced him to his own vice president. From what he recalled of yesterday, he'd only seen other members of his own cabinet, like the toad-faced Secretary of Commerce who smelled like burnt chicken. Rolling onto his back, he wondered what the deal with them was. Surely he would get to meet this mysterious VP soon. It didn't seem like the kind of thing anyone could hide for long. Ready for bed, sir? Cole asked, making James sit up in fright. Good grief, Cole, James said, scratching his head. Yes, I'm ready. Good night, sir, the muscular man said, only half visible from within the bathroom, where James saw him turn off the light. Well, if they don't tell me by tomorrow, James thought as he closed his eyes, I'll just threaten to sick one of the IGs on them. A light-hearted smile crept across his face, just before the hidden sleep spell took full effect on his mind. As dreams of epic battles, beautiful co-pilots of mechs, and towering dragons set in, James didn't even hear Cole being murdered just a couple of feet away. Groggy from his sleep, James heard his alarm clock going off. He groaned, reaching over to where he knew it rested on his accent table, and tried to turn it off. His eyes shot open, feeling only a smooth, dusty surface like wet concrete. Sitting upright, he felt the gentle heat from a beam of light coming from a hole in the wall above him. Struggling to his feet, James realized that he was no longer in his new bed, but he was still wearing his nice presidential suit and tie. Instead of the presidential suite, this was little more than 4 concrete walls and a floor. A jail cell, just like the ones from Alcatraz Island. Beginning to panic, he forced his sleepiness away as he stood up and gazed at the light coming in through the only opening in his new prison. He could see some kind of glass surrounded by steel reinforcements that kept the small space locked up tight. From it, the beam of light streamed down upon him, highlighting the dirt and gravel stuck in his hair and on his clothes. Quickly brushing himself off, he wondered where Maurice and Cole were. A thunderous roar shook the cell, making James fall back on his butt. The ground trembled beneath his feet as he saw small rocks wiggle across the hard concrete. Terrified, he looked up at the hole from which the light came as a headache wrapped itself around his skull. Where on earth had he ended up now? Except he wasn't on Earth anymore, at least not his Earth. This realization made his headache worse as he remembered the many strange things he'd seen since he'd gotten here. For all he knew, that roar had come from a giant world-shattering monster outside, getting ready to crush everything beneath its heel, all while he wondered where the two muscular men who watched him every second of the day were. Holding his head, he wondered if everything up until this point had been a dream. It seemed possible, especially the part about the iron golems. Those were way too cool to actually exist. That thought didn't make him laugh like he'd hoped it would. Instead, he felt like panicking as anxiety and paranoia over where the door was and how he got in here. Instead, he felt like panicking as anxiety and paranoia over where the door was and how he got in here settled over him. Maybe he'd been shoved in through the small window? If that were the case, then how is he not currently crushed into pieces, he argued against himself. Of course, it could have been magic, but... Losing his train of thought, James looked around. He tried to steady his breathing as he remembered his dad's wise counsel. Panicking only makes things worse, so suck it up and deal with it. Taking a few deep breaths, he figured no one would leave him here without wanting to eventually come back, so he just needed to hold out until his captors returned. Or until he found a way out. Carefully standing up, James looked from one side of the concrete box to the other, remembering that one movie about the man who became a count after being imprisoned for years. He recalled how the man had spent his time tunneling out, and figured now was as good a time as ever to start picking apart the walls. Suddenly, he backed up into something hard, which made him jump. Spinning around, he saw a simple wooden table and chair with a written note on it that definitely hadn't been there a moment ago. Stepping closer, he recognized the handwriting. Quickly sitting down, James started to read what was written as best he could. Dear James, it started. That wasn't good, he realized. He couldn't remember a time when anyone had actually called him by his first name. I regret to inform you that a nationwide emergency has reached its peak. While we hoped to have the situation resolved by the time of your swearing in, it seems circumstances have turned dire. James gulped. For your information, there has been a slew of organized rebellious protests against any form of federal leadership across the nation. We believe these violent rioters are heading straight for the Capitol. Additionally, we've learned that the organizers seem to be connected to a DRA. James looked at the paper and saw that the ink was smudged beyond recognition. The rest of the letter, while seemingly short, had been scribbled in a hurry to the point that James couldn't read the rest. The only other words in the document that were visible to him was a small signature at the bottom of the page. Vice President. Sitting back in his chair, the light from the hole in the ceiling mocked him with its gentle warmth on his back. Violent rioters were on their way to the Capitol? What were they even protesting? He hadn't even been sworn in yet. A shudder went down his spine as he wondered if any of them had magical abilities. If they did, then being put in a jail cell was the least of his worries. Getting up from the chair, James felt real hopelessness start to fill each corner of his brain. He felt like a bystander during a fight between a giant robot and a monster, completely at the mercy of everything around him. With more questions running through his mind, James recalled one of the few things he'd remembered from his days in the Boy Scouts. If you're ever lost at sea, write down your thoughts and don't forget to talk to yourself. Otherwise, you're likely to lose your cool and make terrible decisions. Or something. Looking at the extra paper and feathered pens on the wooden table, James felt the ground beneath his feet shake once more. Without any other ideas and feeling overwhelmed, he grabbed one of the pens, dipped it in an ink tray, and began to tell his story. 2 days ago, I was summoned to another world to be its new president. Chapter 7. You're Not Dead. I can't sleep. James wrote that line for the second time in a row. His eyes felt heavy as the sunlight began to shine through the hole in the upper wall once more. From that alone, he could tell that it had been 3 days since he'd woken up in here, with no end in sight. Thankfully, food had appeared every morning and night, carefully laid for him on the desk on beautiful silver trays. He'd hardly eaten any of it. There hadn't been any further communication from the outside since his initial letter from the vice president. Worse still, stress and panic had begun to overwhelm him last night, making it impossible to get any shut-eye. James noticed he'd started making a ring in the small amount of dirt on the floor as he'd paced around, reciting every old movie quote and reference he could think of whenever his hand had gotten sore from writing his thoughts down. He'd even started remembering Saturday morning cartoons that his siblings had begged him to watch, and it unnerved him to think of how much he missed those little colorful characters beating each other up with bombs and anvils. If only he had magic or bombs of his own, then maybe he'd have found a way out by now. Looking at the walls, he wished he could find something to scratch them with. Unfortunately, the feather pens weren't as strong as the ones he'd first signed his name with, and the wooden furniture didn't last long against solid concrete. Perhaps the strangest part of his isolation had been the realization of how much he missed his roommates. Sure, Mace was drunk at times and Charlie's socks smelled, but being forced to play ball or go to another party as a chaperone would have been better than being trapped in a concrete cube, he thought as he gave up trying to sleep and slid back into his chair. Where is everybody? James wondered, grabbing his hair and grinding his teeth together. He tried not to cry. Even if no one ever found him again, he promised himself that he wouldn't cry like he had back in the closet. Even if this turned out to be some terrible prank, James refused to sink back to the level he'd been at. Things were different now. He'd gotten his wish, and that meant he was the hero now. Never give in, never surrender. The hopeful thought came to him once more. Although it hailed from a parody, the words held true even now. James wiped his eyes with his sleeve, not caring if his face became dirtier because of it. These last couple of days had been ones of reflection for him, and he'd quickly learned a lot more about himself than he'd ever wanted to know. Looking down at the now complete acceptance speech he'd left on the desk, James grimaced at the collection of loose thoughts he'd scribbled together. I promise to serve all of you as you serve me, one line proclaimed. I will lead us into a better tomorrow, one free from tyranny and strife. None shall harm America while I stand above it all. Why can't I just give a heroic speech for once, he wondered. Above his speech sat the letter that mysteriously appeared, signed by his vice president, whom he still knew so little about. If he'd been a better artist, he might have tried to draw what that person might look like. In his mind, he imagined someone large and strong, like Maurice and Cole, perhaps kissing his wife goodbye the morning before the riots had begun. He wondered if he'd made it back home safe and sound before the roaring started. The memories of his cabinet began to fill his mind. He remembered Mr. Russo and his cool way of speaking. Even if rioters did eventually find them, that man would certainly be able to hold his own against whatever the mobs did. What about Mrs. Pierce? She didn't seem nearly as combat ready as Mr. Russo had. James wondered if she was okay, maybe trying to cheer up the soldiers and police defending the Capitol as the danger grew ever closer. He wondered if maybe she'd only pretended to be happy all along. Then James remembered Miss Houston. While he still didn't fully trust her, he couldn't deny that she had started to grow on him. If they'd had a little more time, James wondered if she would have taught him some magic spells or something. Hopefully, this world wasn't one where only certain people could learn it. If it was, well, he was the president. There had to be a law or something he could pass that would make magic available to him. Taking another look at his speech, he noticed some extra space at the bottom. Amidst the scribbles and edits he'd made over the past few days, he could see just enough room for one more line. It didn't take more than a second for James to realize what should go there. Picking up his pen, he dipped it in the last small drop of ink and signed the names of his cabinet as finely as he could. Then, with a smile, He added his own signature, making it as large as possible. With that, James set down his pen and parchment. Leaning back in his seat, his gaze reached the ceiling as the light from his small hole outside fell over his shoulders and onto his paper. For a moment, all the anxiety and worry he'd pent up seemed to vanish. He'd done it. He'd written his own acceptance speech, and it had only taken him 3 days in isolation. Sure, it wasn't pretty, but he couldn't recall a time when he'd ever written anything longer than 3 paragraphs. Yet here he was with something that could be put in a museum someday. Mom would have been so proud. For a moment, James felt a sense of satisfaction in his efforts. If he'd ever get the chance again, he promised himself he would be the best president ever. Suddenly, the world turned literally upside down. Falling out of his chair and towards the ceiling, he felt the air fly out of his lungs as he soared through the air. A single scream escaped his lips as he tumbled around his prison, the light from the small window staying consistent while gravity shifted this way and that. It was as though the room were in the pocket of a kid who'd just discovered what parkour was. Yelling and grunting as the chair, pens, ink, and parchment all crashed into him, James remembered that the table he'd been sitting at was quite heavy. He had tried to move it on his first day to see outside, but sadly, it seemed to have either been bolted to the floor or too heavy to budge. At this very moment, he realized it had been the latter. Tumbling around, James caught a glimpse of the table heading his way, shouting for someone to help him, did nothing to stop the heavy wooden object as it came hurling through the air and clipped the side of his shoulder. Shouting as sharp pain ran down his arm, James felt the chair slam into his back just before one of the pens whizzed by his cheek. A fresh cut now ran over his face. His heart racing and pain increasing, James decided to try spinning since that was a good trick. Maybe it would lessen the blows, came his thoughts as the chairs and table crashed into one another while gravity shifted again. As the table whistled through the air, James said a prayer and asked that Mace would somehow learn the benefits of being sober for more than a week. Suddenly, everything froze. Splinters hung in the air around him as dust frozen millimeters from his head. Before he could fully register what was happening, everything faded to black. Sir. Sir. Sir, are you still with us? A voice called. It sounded far distant, like the sound effects in a video game after a flashbang went off. James opened his eyes and saw a giant man with broken sunglasses standing over him. His face wore a look of concern as he ripped his earpiece out of his head and tossed it aside. Maurice? James asked weakly. His shoulder throbbed as tears began to fall from his face. The well-dressed bodyguard helped James onto his feet as the sound of falling rocks and dirt echoed through the hallway. James recognized this place. The long hallway leading from the summoning chamber to the Oval Office hadn't changed a bit since his first day here. Why did you leave me? James asked as tears fell onto the dusty floor beneath him. All around him, the many doors trembled within their frames as distant gunfire echoed down the corridor. I never left you, sir, Maurice said, taking James around a corner before pulling something out of his coat pocket. You were here the whole time. James looked up and realized what he was holding. In the large man's hands was a concrete cube with a tiny hole cut out near the top of one of the walls. It's a one-time use, Maurice said, tossing the small box aside. We need to get you back to the summoning room. Why? James demanded. He was tired of being kept in the dark, literally. No time, sir, Maurice said, leaving James leaning up against the wall while he kicked open a nearby door. After checking inside, he looked at James and nodded for him to follow. Clenching his teeth so hard he thought they might break, James forced himself to follow his bodyguard. Where was Cole? He thought, as he looked at the oddly normal-looking office. He hoped that Cole hadn't been eaten by one of the slime monsters Miss Houston had talked about. Agent Cole is gone, sir, Maurice said, his tone quiet as he began going through a filing cabinet. He was ambushed during an assassination attempt 3 nights ago. Maurice seemed to pause, his fingers between 2 files, as though looking at an old family photo. Cole was dead? The realization hit James almost as hard as the table had. The Capitol is under siege. Maurice said, quickly pushing the files back before slamming the filing cabinet closed. I was instructed to get you back home until we can get the situation under control. James felt the pain in his back, shoulder, and cheek go numb. Go back? After everything they'd shown him, they were just going to send him away when the going got tough? Didn't they have magic and giant elemental robots and stuff? What could possibly challenge them at this point? Please stay alert, sir, Maurice said, shoving another filing cabinet closed. Walking over to him, he handed him what looked like a weird-looking gun. Only use this if absolutely necessary, the bodyguard instructed. Carefully taking the weapon, James felt a rush of conflicting emotions, all flashing around him like a poorly edited meme. He didn't know what to think as he stared at the gun in his hand. This all suddenly felt so real. Wait, James said. He hobbled forward and watched as Maurice grabbed a black, ooze-covered desk. Who's attacking us? We are, a voice came from behind them. James screeched and dropped to the ground as Maurice threw the desk overhead at the intruder. A loud crash echoed around the room as splintered wood sprayed everywhere. Full of adrenaline, James was already getting to his feet as Maurice shouted for him to move. Rolling to the side, a blast of heat tore right past his head. Striking something behind him, the force sent him tumbling in his bodyguard's direction. Get up! Get up! Maurice shouted, yanking him off his feet like a child getting pulled out of the way of an oncoming car. Just as Maurice threw James behind him, a more intense blast came spiraling through the air like a fire tornado. James shouted as it hit Maurice head on, the flames wrapping around his body like a tortilla around taco meat. After a split second, the flames faded away. Maurice stood frozen in place, not moving an inch. James watched the large man's arms disintegrate, falling into a pile of ash as his body drifted apart into a gray cloud. James stared at the charred remains of the man who had saved his life. The awful scent of burnt flesh mixed in his nostril with a sweeter perfume as the one responsible casually walked over. Their footsteps were hauntingly slow as James felt his tears drip down his face. Looking up at his foe, he clenched the gun in his hand as that cheerful smile greeted him. Hello, James, Mrs. Pierce said. Chapter 8. The Troll. You. A single whisper fluttered through James's lips as he watched the smiling woman stroll closer to him, walking through Maurice's remains as orange flames danced up the side of her arm. Sorry you had to see that, she said, smiling as smoke wrapped around her shoulder. I'm sure Maurice claimed we were under attack. More confusion set in as the flames on Mrs. Pierce's arm died down. Once completely gone, she extended her hand to him, her curly hair still perfectly done up and her blazer as clean as the day she'd met him. We need to get you to the war room before Miss Houston throws a fit, she said, her tone on the verge of a light-hearted chuckle. James stared at her hand, reminded of a certain Dark Lord tempting his son to join him. Come on, sir, Mrs. Pierce said. We're going to need your statement on what Maurice tried to do to you. What? A shadow fell across James's face. He tilted his head down and reached up with his left hand, recalling what he'd always wished Luke had done during that famous scene. Sorry, ma'am. Let's head back, James said, allowing himself to be pulled to his feet. Yes, let's, Mrs. Pierce said, holding onto his hand and starting to guide him away. As fast as he could, James tried to point the gun at her head. Aiming the weapon at her temple, he pulled the trigger and closed his eyes. A pathetic click came as no shot was fired. Stepping back, all the pain from his tumble with the desk and chair felt numb as his adrenaline pumped through his veins. He watched Mrs. Pierce slowly turn back and smile evilly at him. Her hair seemed to glow as more flames started to climb up her arms. I'm so dead, James thought, his eyes widening. He clutched his shoulder, impressed at his own resolve, but horrified at the fact that he'd been so ready. He wasn't even sure she was the bad guy yet. As Mrs. Pierce took a step towards him, he heard the sloosh of a liquid. In a panic, he leapt back, dropping the gun and holding his fists out as the pain from his injuries returned. Mrs. Pierce's smile grew larger than her face, each of her teeth sharpening into fangs as she grew a little taller. Her shoulders grew spikes as the demonic-looking woman chuckled before waving a finger his way. "You shouldn't have done that, boy," she growled. James felt something move behind him. Daring to look over his shoulder, the pain in his body vanished as he saw the ashes that had once been Maurice slowly begin to rise, taking the shape of a large man. The black ooze rolled its thick neck back, glaring at the monstrous Mrs. Pierce before straightening its gooey tie. James realized what was missing and carefully handed the slimy man his broken sunglasses. The bodyguard took them without hardly moving, his form solidifying and returning to exactly the way it had been before. "We need to leave, sir," he said, as if nothing had happened. "You're welcome to try," Mrs. Pierce laughed, the flames dancing up the sides of her arms and blowing her hair back. As it reached the sides of her face, her skin seemed to crumple and burn away like cardboard. "Oh no," James said, watching her stand proudly before them as her body began to break down. She snarled slightly as her skin cracked, flames wrapping around her form as everything began to burn. Her head fell apart as her mouth broke in half like a fiery egg that had decided to hatch. "I suppose there's no hiding anymore," she grumbled, reaching up and slowly pulling down on the back of her hair. As she did, her body tore and began to grow, getting larger than even Maurice as long yellow horns grew from the top of her head. Ridiculously long claws extended from her fingers as a silky blue suit grew over her entire body. Her hair fell off completely like a cheap Halloween wig, as her chin bloated out while a set of long, jagged fangs grew down over the corners of her mouth. "What is this?" James started to say, falling backward. "That," Maurice muttered, the slightest bit of contempt in his voice as he glared at their foe, "is a troll." For James, that kind of killed the moment. Sure, it described the well-dressed yellow creature standing before them, but the word troll had been so overused back home it almost didn't feel right. Besides, trolls were just big, ugly guys with clubs. This looked more like a snazzy, well-dressed dragon person, horns and all. "Oh, Maurice, please," the troll said, its voice royal and deep. "We prefer dragon spawn." To James, it almost sounded like the voiceover guy who did every movie trailer ever. "Who are you?" James asked, crawling back to Maurice. "Call me Syrian," the troll said, rubbing the side of his neck smugly. "Of course, I already know who you are, Mr. James." "Oh, really?" James challenged, getting up and clenching his fists. "Bet you don't. Come on, I can take you." A strong look from Maurice stopped him as the tall troll laughed. "Come now, Maurice," Syrian chuckled, some drool coming out from behind his fangs. "Let him try again." "Sir, we need to run," Maurice said, nodding to the door. "I'll cover you." Maurice's hand suddenly morphed and became long and pointy, like a chunky dagger. Where in the world had all of this come from? Had Cole been able to do this as well? "We don't have to fight, Maurice," Syrian said, putting his gnarly claws together as his suit gleamed in the small amount of light left in the room. "We'd be happy to have you back on the team." Maurice stopped as the room around them began to change. The door opened as tons of familiar faces stepped inside, all sharing the same evil smile as the troll before them had. "Traitors!" Maurice shouted as the room filled up with people and creatures James recognized. The frog-headed Secretary of Commerce, some of the cat people, even a few of the technicians he remembered seeing in the endless caves of IGs. All of them stood before them, surrounding them on every side. "Not traitors," one of the cat people meowed, her face melting and morphing before their eyes. "Just heroes on the right side of history," the troll cooed, its yellow skin standing out amidst a sea of strange creatures and bodies. Suddenly, every individual around them began to melt and change, quickly turning into monstrous trolls of every size and shape. Oddly, all of them wore some kind of formal suit, making the room look like the most horrifying meeting James had ever been a part of. Stranger still, each one looked different from the last, with the only consistent detail being that yellow skin. One looked so tall that all James could see was its neck, while the rest of its head stuck up through the ceiling. "Blasted Syrian," Maurice said, suddenly sounding infuriated. His pointed hand stabbed the very air around James's head, making him wince as the bodyguard shouted at the troll. "How long have you been Pierce?" he demanded. "My friend, Pierce never was," Syrian the troll laughed. "You've been outnumbered from the start." "You've fallen off, Morty," one of the shorter trolls said, his voice deeper than James had been expecting. "You could have been one of us," a troll with a very thin head barked, its eyes rolling around its head like a chameleon. "But you had to snuggle up to the govies." "Now, Clancy, there's still time," Syrian sighed, reaching up and rubbing his eyes like an actor during a blooper reel. "But only if Maurice comes to his senses." "You're all traitors to your country," Maurice roared, waving his sharpened hand around the office. "And for that, you're gonna die right here, and no one's gonna remember you." "Great flames! Touched a nerve there, didn't I?" Syrian laughed, holding up both claws mockingly. James could almost see Maurice's breath as he seemed to be reaching for something in his suit. "The dragon has something good lined up for this country, Maurice. He'd welcome you into his ranks." What's he doing? James wondered, watching Maurice carefully pull something out of his suit coat pocket. Strangely, none of the trolls seemed to care. "I'd rather die serving my president than live under your false king." It was worth a shot," Syrian said, rubbing his claws together. "Well, we really should be going." "You're not going anywhere," Maurice challenged, his sharpened hand becoming a giant swollen fist. "Oh, Maurice," Syrian cooed, leaning forward so that he was at James's eye level. "You stole my line." "Get down, Mr. President!" Maurice shouted, grabbing James's back and starting to morph over and around him. James gasped, feeling sick as Maurice's suit and skin coated him, sealing around him as he heard Syrian make a clicking noise. Fire from the surrounding trolls suddenly poured over them. It was so intense, both James and Maurice cried out as the heat felt like it was cooking them from the outside in. After an agonizing moment or two, the flames all vanished. Looking at his hands, James was surprised to see no burn marks. "If I remember correctly, you were rather weak to fire," Syrian said, taking a step closer. "Then again, everything is weak to fire. Well, either way, we'll be taking young James now." James looked around, feeling Maurice ooze off him as the slimy bodyguard tried to reform himself. He watched his black suit start to take shape, only to fall apart like a man made of sand. Now, James," Syrian said, standing right in front of him. "Let's make this easy." "Sir," Maurice muttered, his body only half reformed. "Don't let him." Another blast of fire caused Maurice to splash backward against the wall and window. His scream made James's skin crawl. "You had your chance, Maurice," Syrian said, putting one giant, foul-smelling claw on James's shoulder. "Now let's give the would-be president a chance." James heard something clack against the ground from behind him. Looking over his shoulder, he saw the gun Maurice had given him on the ground. Unlike before, something was flashing along the handle. The word "armed" glowed with a red light just beneath the trigger. Heat and smoke seemed to pour off the weapon's frame as James looked back at the troll. "Come on, son," Syrian said, patting his back with the claw. "Time to surrender." Without thinking, James tore himself out of the troll's grasp. Lunging out of Maurice's ooze, he grabbed the weapon and pointed it at Syrian's face. Feeling like the world was caught in a slow-motion bubble, James smiled and said the only thing that came to his mind: "I never surrender." The troll's eyes widened as James pulled the trigger. Chapter 9: Monster Mosh Pit. "James!" Maurice gurgled, violently shattering the painful silence that hung over the room. James blinked in confusion. Why was he suddenly looking down at his still splattered bodyguard? And himself. Staring at his own face, he reached up to touch his chin. His hand didn't move. Instead, all that came was an angry shout from his body. "By the dragon's curse!" Syrian screamed in James's body. James stood there in horror as his old body gazed helplessly at his arms. Suddenly, he watched himself grab and pull at his skin as though he were trying to tear it off. "My body! You stole my beautiful body!" Holy cow. That was all James could say as he felt the other trolls start to move towards him. It felt as though everything was caught in slow motion again, the edges of all before him leaving trails of light through the air as he looked down at his claws. They looked like triceratops horns growing out of each finger. "Get him! I mean me! You know what I mean!" Syrian shouted, still trying to pull himself apart. Looking up, James felt the world around him start to fade as sparks fell over his new suit. The smell of a million campfires filling his nostrils as the world around him changed. The walls and ceiling morphed before his eyes, altering from the destroyed office into a red inferno. As the light of his new surroundings filled his vision, James saw something huge curled up in the center of this massive red cave. It raised its head slowly, revealing thousands of spines and horns as its millions of frills twitched and fluttered menacingly in some alien-like display. It opened its terrible eyes, each ugly ball full of fire and shards of what looked like red glass. Its massive jaws stretched into a horrible smile, revealing rows of jagged, blood-red teeth. "I see you," the nightmare dragon growled. "President Troll." Before James could say a word, the world started to shake again. He looked up just in time to watch a giant stone spike dislodge from the ceiling. It fell right at his head. Before he could do anything, he felt something punch his hand. Snapping back to reality, James stepped back and realized his claw was on his old body's shoulder. The angry monster screamed in his voice, demanding his body back while, all around him, the rest of the trolls prepared to step in, baring their terrible teeth and moving towards them. Faster than the eye could see, James adjusted his claws from his old body's shoulder to his neck, dragging him into the air with ease. The trolls froze. "Everyone stay back," James warned, surprised at how easy it was to lift his old self into the air. It wouldn't take much force to break his own neck, though he told himself that was a line he wasn't going to cross. Thankfully, the yellow monsters seemed smarter than they appeared and immediately stopped their advances. "Let him go!" one of the smaller trolls yelled, shaking his hands in front of him like some sort of polluted sign language. "Boss Syrian's gonna squash you," another hissed. "Well, I'm your boss now," James said, barely controlling his tone. "And I say back off. Before I..." "Sir, the weapon," Maurice gurgled weakly. James looked over his shoulder and saw the Secret Service man struggling to keep himself in one piece. He seemed to be melting faster than he could pull himself together. "Please, give me the weapon." "The gun thing? Where is it?" he asked, moving around. Crunch. A sickening sound came from beneath his right heel. Slowly looking down, he pulled his giant troll foot back, revealing the broken remains of the gun-shaped device. An angry gasp came from Syrian as he kicked and struggled with all his might. You idiot!" Syrian shouted, holding his own neck while gasping for air. "Aye! Anyone else hear that?" one of the trolls called out. The ground started to shake once more as a sound pounded through James's head. He looked around and noticed the ceiling trembling as if under a great weight. As rubble began to fall, the trolls around them started to scatter, ignoring their leader's shouts. "Don't leave me, you cowards!" Syrian gasped. Looking up, James saw a piece of sharp rubble not far above his head. Dropping his old body and leaping back, he watched it come down with a sickening crunch on Syrian, the resulting mess not leaving much to the imagination. Gagging, James looked away as more debris started coming down. He felt drywall and jagged blocks smash into his back and shoulders, yet no pain seemed to enter his mind. It was almost like getting hit by one of those padded poles while balancing over a foam pit. Looking around the crumbling structure, he spied Maurice still struggling to reform himself. More debris fell from the ceiling above him. Without thinking, James sprinted over. Tackling the slimy mess that was Maurice, James felt them both slam against a nearby window before everything went black. The force shook his brain and caused him to reach up as if to prevent his mind from spinning out through his ears. "The walls are indestructible, sir," Maurice coughed, dust filling the air. "There's no way out from here." A terrible dread fell over the pair as the walls stayed firm where the ceiling continued coming down. There had to be a way out. They couldn't give in. They couldn't surrender. Not now, when they'd already survived so much. "Think," James told himself, looking around as more debris fell. An idea suddenly popped into his mind. It was so crazy, it had to work. Spinning around, he slapped debris out of his way before pointing a single yellow claw above them. "Comma something something," he said, willing himself to use a fire blast. A huge jet of flames suddenly poured out from his shoulder, crawling past his elbow and to the tips of his claws. Boom! The heat from the blast was beyond intense, punching through concrete, metal, and wood alike. Even the dust melted away as a hole in the falling debris formed just above them. A strong beam of light came pouring through the cavity, like the abduction rays of a UFO. Trying to turn the fire on his arm off, James felt Maurice melting beneath him. A gurgle came out of the slime as his suit and clothes formed a black puddle around his feet. "Ah, I'm sorry, Maurice," James shouted, looking up at the hole he'd made. Unable to turn off the flames, he put his arm off to the side and watched the heat blast go through the remains of the front door and across the hall. Scooping up as much of Maurice as he could in his not on fire hand, James looked above them and jumped with all his might. "Whoa!" he screamed as they pounded through rubble, popping out through the smoke and dust like a cartoon character as the flames on his arms began to die down. The fresh air rushed over them like a tidal wave. James couldn't tell if it was his new troll senses or his own glee, but the sunlight and the smell of grass flooded his senses in a relief so wonderful it was as though he'd leapt into the most beautiful forest the world had ever known. Only then did the gunfire and smoke hit his nostrils. Shaking himself out of his daze, James looked around as he and what was left of Maurice began to fall back to the earth. The surrounding buildings, roads, and grassy fields were either charred or still ablaze. Everywhere he looked, he spotted fantasy monsters of every kind, all attacking and burning everything in sight. What had been destroyed surrounded them like a stain of fire and ash splattered against the earth. It was then that James remembered that landing from this height could hurt really, really bad, even with his new troll body. "Oh no!" James cried, beginning to tumble through the air. Hugging the slimy remains of Maurice as tightly as he could, he curled his legs underneath him and watched a confused group of creatures brandishing swords with guns built into their handles look up at them. Once they seemed to realize what was happening, they wasted no time scattering in every direction as James hit the ground with a thud as powerful as the shelling in the distance. Gravel and rock shattered against their bodies, yet still he felt no pain. He heard piles of dirt and debris land nearby, some of it slapping his back as the nearby creatures screamed and ran away. Slowly getting to his feet, James felt patches of sod and dirt slide off his back as he looked around. Somehow, he had no trouble standing up as some of the creatures began to approach him. Surprisingly, many of them began to smile as soon as their eyes rested on him. "Lord Syrian, were you successful?" one of them called out. Has the White House fallen? Remembering that he wasn't in his own body anymore, James stood up as straight as he could. It took all his strength, but he found the power within to resist the urge to vomit. Dropping Maurice's slimy remains, James felt his mental fortitude fail. Falling to his knees, his stomach felt like a volcano about to burst open with magma. Pitifully, he dragged his claws through the ground as more than one of the creatures came to his aid. Out of the way, scum! A fox-like creature with 3 heads yelled, its voice echoing across the battlefield as James was pulled from the crater he'd made. Get a medic, or I'll eat you myself! As he was pulled out, James begged himself not to throw up. He couldn't handle that, not on top of what was happening with Maurice and the trolls and the sudden attack and Mrs. Pierce. Taking some deep breaths, he grabbed his mouth with his claws and felt his eyes begin to water. The stench of the creatures around him was most unpleasant, and he worried that one of the smells hitting him was his own. Here, boss, this one's fresh, a creature that looked like a bipedal giraffe called out, throwing something at James's feet. Jumping back, he wrapped both hands tightly around his mouth as the urge to throw up suddenly vanished. In its place now rested pure shock at who they'd given him. Laid out across the bullet-riddled lawn of the White House was a ragged, albeit not quite dead, Mr. Russo. The Secretary of Defense coughed and tried getting onto his feet, only for the 3-headed fox creature to kick him back down. Stay down, Govey. One of its heads smiled, sounding like every stereotypical evil British villain ever. Milord's gonna eat you now. What? James said without meaning to. The surrounding creatures looked at him in confusion. Covering up his mouth again, James cursed himself. They must have recognized that wasn't what their leader sounded like. He's not to your liking, is he? One of the 3-headed fox creature's heads said, snapping in vain at the shocked-looking middle head. This is all your fault, Milo. We should have saved him, that black slime with the mustache. Oh no, that's not it. You gonna eat him or not, my lord? A voice called from behind them. The biggest set of hands James had ever seen fell on his shoulders, spinning him around and making him come face to face with the ugliest creature he'd ever seen. Instantly, he thought of one of the hosts of that British car show that used to be really funny. Well, is ya or is ya not? The giant roared impatiently. I'm starving. I'll eat him for you if that's swell. There's a slime with him! Another monster shouted, running over and pointing dramatically at the crater. It's still alive, another more intelligent creature pointed out. It'll make a valuable prisoner. We take prisoners? Something else called out. By this point, James saw other armed beasts coming their way. Their weapons looked like swords with rifles woven into the metal in an almost artistic manner. They reminded James of bayonets, but much more jagged. Wait, the 3-headed fox said. Most of the mumbling stopped, and James waited as it walked right up to him, foaming at the sides of its third mouth, a little, as it squinted at him suspiciously. My lord, do you know my name? It asked. I do, one of the mutant animal people called out loud. A loud crack and a snap were heard before something covered from head to toe in brown hair ran off screaming. Oh, perfect, James thought as he looked down into the eyes of the middle fox head. As their eyes met, the creature seemed to whimper in fear. The edges of its eyes watered as snot and drool dripped down the sides of its face. Lord Syrian, it almost whispered. Don't you recall the name of your most loyal follower? It asked, wicked smiles spreading across its other 2 mouths. A grumble came from the surrounding crowd of enemies as the fox mutant spat a little on the ground. As it did, James noticed Mr. Russo was staring at him through the trickle of blood running down his head. Beside him, the remains of Maurice had slithered over, looking now more like homemade slime than the once tall and intimidating bodyguard. They need time, James thought, looking at his claws. He could try fighting, but the flames from his arm had only just fizzled out. He didn't want to accidentally erase Maurice and Mr. Russo from the census. Suddenly, James had an idea. Taking a deep breath and steadying himself, he tried his best not to cringe as he remembered the way Syrian had moved and talked, trying his best to assume the same confident posture as he heard Maurice start to gurgle something quietly to Mr. Russo. Carefully brushing the top of one of his claws down the side of the fox's right face, he forced himself to smile, even as the rough fur felt like sandpaper. Your name, little Milo, means nothing to me, James said, trying to make his voice sound as smooth as possible. The air around him suddenly felt colder, as the ground continued to rumble from nearby fighting. Frankly, James said, moving his hand away swiftly and feeling the fat on his chin jiggle against his collar and tie. I'm insulted you'd even ask, he said, giving the three-headed fox mutant a look of disappointment before slowly turning and holding his arms out to the crowd. My friends, our victory is assured. Against all the government could throw at me, I have successfully squashed their would-be president into mush, he said triumphantly. The crowd gasped in awe. He heard Maurice gurgle again. Excellent. A voice chirped in the back of his mind. Mr. President, help is on the way, Mr. Russo said, clearly in pain. Help is on the way. Just keep them occupied a bit longer. Stall a bunch of monsters with guns? Yeah, sure, he could do that. Without thinking, references began to flow through James's mind. Memes and movie quotes began to fall from his lips as the monsters around him watched in anticipation, gunfire echoing off in the distance. His favorite moments from shows and movies began to fall into place like a jukebox machine, pulling out old CDs. Oh, you're approaching me? I told the president and his forces, James said, pointing at the giant. Despite knowing who I am, you've approached me. Why does that sound familiar? The giant asked, putting his hands together. James paused. Oh, are you feeling lucky, punk? He challenged, turning back to the fox and tapping his claw against its chest. Does that idiot want to dance with a demon in the moonlight? The fox mutants' heads all seemed to watch with awe as James turned dramatically. Well, whatever. It was rigged from the start. Their would-be president stood no chance. That's amazing, one of the fox heads said, smiling like a maniac. I wish I could have seen it. I'd have brought you the Gubby's heads on a silver platter. Swear it, James commanded, changing his voice again. If this performance hadn't been so life or death, he would have laughed. Huh? Milo asked, backing into a minotaur who shoved him forward. Seduce me, James challenged, the edges of his mouth turning into a smile. Whoa, what? Do what he says, a goblin called out. James slowly spun around in a circle before looking back down on the three-headed creature. You gonna cry about it? Or are you gonna sit there and take it like a man? James yelled. Some of the other creatures started yelling back, calling for the fox's heads. But, the miserable monster whimpered. Wrong, sir, James shouted. You are terribly wrong. Pulling an imaginary list out of thin air, James began to go down it while glaring back at Milo and his other heads. You disappoint me, Master Kenobi. You've questioned my leadership. Can't you see I'm clearly walking here? Somewhere over the rainbow, that's where I'd send you if I could. Where has the rum gone? James paused, letting the crowd yell a little while longer. Lowering his gaze so that it fell on the now cowering fox creature, he took a deep breath and prepared to deliver the final reference. You're a disease, and I'm the cure. The crowd roared. James held his claws high, nodding and looking around as the mutants and monsters fired their weapons with reckless abandon into the air. He could hear the fox's cries of confusion and terror as the beasts began calling for it to be strung up. Bury him alive! Eat the traitor whole! He can't seduce nobody! What's a disease? After a moment more of hollering and shouting, James suddenly raised his claws. Most fell silent. Those who didn't were silenced by their comrades, while he approached the poor fox creature. Making sure his tie was still on straight, he took a moment to brush some of the dirt off of his suit. After his checkup, he pointed at Milo accusingly. Let's make this count, he thought, nodding at the fox creature as tears started coming down its face. It choked on its own breath as it bowed at his feet. Please, my lord, I'll do anything, just don't burn me. What are you asking me to do? The fox mumbled into the dirt. James reached down and picked the three-headed creature up by the scruff of its neck. Getting as close to its horrible faces as possible, he performed the greatest imitation of Mom's serious voice in his life. I'm asking, what are you prepared to do? The fox creature whimpered, all three sets of eyes widening as fire climbed up James's arm. Now! Mr. Russo yelled, holding his wrist up as a blue streak of light exploded from it. James grabbed his head and screamed as sharp pain filled each eye socket. It was as though 1,000 pieces of sand were being pressed into his eyes and ears at the same time. "Grab that Gavi!" a monster shouted. At the same time, James felt a pair of small hands grab him from behind. Mr. Russo shouted something. "What?" James screamed back, letting the struggling fox creature go. Then the hurricane hit. Whirlwinds fell over the field. Instantly, the feeling of sand in his orifices left as James squinted and saw something large dropping like pods around them from the sky. They almost looked like IGs! A nearby mutant shouted, shoving its way past him. Magical gunfire began to rain down all around them, blowing apart the ground and incinerating some of the monsters. Jets began to circle overhead, dropping explosive payloads on the hordes of enemies as those that survived darted for cover. The tormented fox creature was nowhere to be seen, but the giant and the other magical creatures all tried to turn tail and run. Meanwhile, IGs of every environment and size began to land, some small and agile, while other larger ones lumbered about. James saw one backhand the giant aside before stepping on a small pack of angry goblins. Nearby, an aquatic-looking IG was overrun by mutants. Each of the monsters tore into the noble mechanical warrior, blasting it full of holes before it exploded in a shower of coral, sending bodies flying in all directions. As the battle between the awesome robot golems and monsters with guns continued, James felt Mr. Russo drag him to the ground before firing another blue light into the sky. It echoed above their heads like a mix between a game of laser tag and a fireworks show. Creatures were dragged about as one IG broke through a mutant line and ran right up to where they were huddled against the ground. It towered over them, its orange and red exterior looking just like those rock formations in every Western movie ever. "Get in, sir!" Mr. Russo shouted, pulling James up with ease. "Get in what?" James shouted back, looking at the IG's chest as it opened, revealing a hatch that he wasn't sure even Mr. Russo would fit through. Before he could protest, the IG's burnt hand scooped him inside. Rather than hitting a metal structure like he'd thought he would, James continued tumbling back until coming to a sudden stop against something wooden. Rolling onto his back with a grunt, James opened his eyes and saw several ragged-looking people in torn suits and ties, all pointing weapons at his head. Beginning to hold his claws up, one of the men holding the weapons slapped them both back down before pressing a blade against James's throat. "Weapons down," a voice over the intercom commanded. "This one's with us." The people immediately pulled back their blades, several uncocking their weapons like a cowboy would a rifle. That was when James noticed that most of them looked familiar. Suddenly, it clicked. These were all people he'd met before. Unlike last time, however, none of them saluted him or gave him encouraging smiles. Instead, they showered him in looks of distrust, one man clenching the hilt of his weapon so hard his knuckles turned white. He couldn't really blame them. "I'll be down shortly," the voice said, this time sounding a little clearer than last time. Only then did James notice the interior of this IG looked a lot more like an exotic museum of oddities than a robot chest cavity. It even had the ominous giant carpet by the entryway, complete with weird stains in the left corner. James started to get up, grunting as the collar of his suit made sitting upright rather difficult. Thankfully, it didn't take too long, pulling his tie around his neck as he heard someone walking above him. The IG rumbled beneath him, making some nearby busts fall off their display cabinets. A potted plant also took a nosedive, the clay smashing onto the fancy carpet as the lights overhead flickered, making the exotic statues and art pieces look like they were blinking at him. They must have been flying away from the battlefield. Thank heavens, he thought, getting to his feet. He still couldn't believe his little acting stunt had managed to save him, Maurice, and Mr. Russo. James felt his eyes widen. Maurice, Mr. Russo, where were they? Had they gotten away safely? He hadn't made a complete idiot of himself in front of a bunch of ravenous monsters just so they could get left behind. Who was flying this thing anyway? As if in answer to his silent quarry, James heard a hatch open in the ceiling above him as an elevator began to descend to the ground. Watching it carefully, he heard some kind of angelic singing as the door opened, revealing someone who had their back to him. Were those butterfly wings? "I've set a course for Hawaii, everyone," the person said, turning around. "We'll be in friendly territory in roughly 4 hours." With that, the people around them put the remainder of their weapons down. James watched them move over to various pieces of furniture, tables and desks, and even a piano, all of which looked like items he'd seen in mystical antique shops at the beginning of cheesy fantasy movies. As the people approached, the furniture changed into computer screens and stations, all lit up with lights and digital charts and maps showcasing where he guessed the IG currently was. As the workers took to their stations, the person with fairy wings turned and faced James for the first time. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, not smiling as she put her fists on her hips. "Who are you?" James asked, unsure what to say. "Anna Sophia, sir," the girl said, stepping forward and wrinkling her nose as if James's horrid smell had just reached her. "Your vice president. Pleased to make your acquaintance." Chapter 10. One Nation. The first hour of the journey was uncomfortable, to say the least. Poor James learned very quickly that his new body would not allow him to stand all the way up without hitting his head on the ceiling. What was worse was that his clothing, as sharp as the shiny suit might have looked on Syrian, was in a state of disarray after all the action it had seen. Despite this, one of the few things Anna Sophia had confirmed to him was that it would clean itself in no time. "Trolls are neat freaks," she had said as she'd taken him up a set of stairs to the bridge, "when they're not busy murdering everything." That sounded about right. Back when they'd cornered him and Maurice, he noticed how subtly the trolls had been avoiding the dust and rubble, even as the ceiling itself fell to pieces. A part of him hoped that, like Syrian, the other trolls had met their ends within the rubble. He seriously doubted it. Arriving at the bridge with Anna Sophia, James looked out through what he assumed was the IG's head at the passing clouds. They were moving much faster than he felt like they were moving, with some other IGs flying beside them in various states of damage. "Is the military going in to stop all those monsters?" James asked, peeking over the shoulder of a worker at their screen, seeing numbers and code he didn't recognize. "No, Mr. President," Anna Sophia said, sighing and sitting down in the central seat, looking out into the sky. "The American military has been almost completely disbanded." "Say what now?" "What? Why?" James demanded. The central chair swiveled around. The vice president gently brushed her hair back before narrowing her eyes at him. "Something to do with the secret orders of one Mrs. Pierce," she said coldly. "Oh." Looking down, James gritted his sharp teeth. He thought back on the time he'd spent in this new world, and the people he'd met so far. It sounded so cliché, having a traitor in his midst from the start. It was literally a part of every show he'd ever seen, and he'd still fallen for it just like everyone else. Looking back out the window, James wondered what lay in store for him in Hawaii. Hopefully, they had some way of putting poor Maurice back together. Thinking about everything he'd done for him, James made a silent promise to give his bodyguard the Medal of Honor, or whatever they had in these United States of America. He'd have to give something to Mr. Russo, too. Watching them fly through a cloud, James recalled the last few days he'd spent in that prison cube. He still didn't fully understand Maurice's reasoning for leaving him there without much warning. If only everyone had been more honest about the current state of affairs, then he might have... Might have what? That voice in the back of his mind challenged him. Might have gotten in the way even more? James couldn't argue much against that. It didn't seem like he'd done much besides sign papers since he'd gotten here. For all their talk of slaying dragons and fighting alongside eagles, there was a serious lack of action right up until the end. Doubts began to circle his brain as they broke through another cloud amidst the beautiful blue sky. I hope this friendly territory knows how to fix me, James thought, tilting his head down. There's got to be some kind of machine or special spell that could change him back into a human. The more he worried about it, the more his thoughts turned back to what had become of Mr. Russo and poor Maurice. They made it, he told himself. There were IGs everywhere. One of them definitely scooped them both up on the way out. Thinking about everything that had happened following his release, James wondered how Mr. Russo had recognized him at all on the battlefield. Had it been the references? He seriously doubted it. Maybe it was the obvious way he had been clutching Maurice's gooey remains. Though he didn't know much about them, he couldn't imagine many trolls went out of their way to protect Secret Service slimes. As for Maurice himself, nothing felt certain. In trying to save them both, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd unintentionally finished his bodyguard off. Is that a bad thing? The voice asked in the back of his mind. James shook his head. Of course it's a bad thing, he told himself. Maurice had basically taken a 1,000,000-degree hot bullet for him, and now he wasn't even sure if he'd ever see him or Mr. Russo again. Trying to distract himself, he rubbed under his chin as he thought about Anna Sophia. At least now he knew where the obligatory pretty side character had been all this time. Folding his arms and trying to clench his teeth, James felt a stabbing pain in his chin. He quickly released the pressure and felt his face, seeing little droplets of blood where one of his fangs must have poked through the skin of his curved chin. Groaning to himself, he turned around and put his ugly head into his ugly hands. Hawaii would have something to help him. Everything would be fine. This was just the pivotal part of the story where the main character was tried and tested. That's all. Once they got to the ground, Maurice would be patched up, Cole would turn out to still be alive, and Anna Sophia would commend him for his bravery in the face of danger. Everything would be fine. We both know that's not true. Exiting the IG was much easier than getting shoved into one. As the hatch door slowly opened, rays of sunlight poured into the fancy interior of the IG. Blinking a few times, James ducked his horns down as he followed Anna Sophia out into the tropical-smelling Hawaiian tarmac. Good thing one of the crew had thought to warn everyone outside, for upon fully exiting, James was not greeted by gunfire. Instead, soldiers of various ranks all stood at attention, leaving a perfect aisle just big enough for him to walk down. The soldiers all wore different uniforms, some looking like they were about to hop into a jet as that one song about a danger zone blasted through the radio. Some were armed, holding rifles on their shoulders that coursed with a strange green magic mist. As he and Anna Sophia grew closer, James could see that most of the soldiers bore fresh wounds across their arms and heads. None of that stopped them from saluting. "Commander-in-Chief on sight!" one of them shouted. The clap of their feet as they turned to face him made his heart skip a beat. "At ease," James said, half joking. No one moved. Only the sound of nearby IGs landing and unloading could be heard as James heard Anna Sophia clear her throat. "This way, sir," she said, beginning to hover above the ground. With a dainty flutter, her wings vibrated from her back as she scooted her way through the air like a spirit of Christmas past. "A fairy?" James silently cried. He hated fairies back home. They were always so annoying, no matter what film or book they appeared in. Well, he thought, that explains the fluorescent hair. Not seeing an alternative, James walked carefully after her. His footsteps echoed around the airstrip as a few of the soldiers winced as he walked by. One of the Marines on his left suddenly began to fall over. Without thinking, James reached out and caught the man as his rifle clattered to the ground. "Steady," James said, gently cradling the wounded man as blood dripped onto his claws. The soldier's face looked battered. His skin stretched across his skull as his breathing grew shallower. Medical individuals soon arrived. Watching them take the man off his claws, James saw the numb looks in their eyes. As they took the Marine away, James felt a hand on his shoulder. Carefully turning his head, he saw Anna Sophia floating there. Sadness filled her eyes. Though neither said a word, James understood her perfectly. As they turned to go, James caught sight of the Marine's rifle still on the ground. Its green glow pulsed for a moment longer before going out completely. Walking away, he didn't notice as the weapon of the fallen soldier turned to ash on the runway. As another IG landed nearby, the sounds of nearby soldiers and technicians began to grow distant. Following Anna Sophia to a nearby group of hangars, James felt something bitter in the back of his throat. Walking past the remaining soldiers, his eyes darted around. There had to be something else he could focus on that would take him away from the world ending around him. Surprisingly, his suit caught his eye more than anything else. He noted that Anna Sophia hadn't been wrong about what it would do. Every scratch, rip, and tear had cleared up rather well. As he quickly looked over himself, James wished he could know what the soldiers around him thought of his appearance. They must hate me already, he thought, wondering if most of the country was under attack by trolls and other magical creatures that looked like him. Surely some of these soldiers had already been fighting such monsters before, just barely making their way here to regroup. After all of that, to think this was their first encounter with him, who was meant to be their next commander-in-chief? At the entrance to the hangars, James saw Anna Sophia speaking in a hushed tone with someone who looked like he'd give Stallone a run for his money. "Sir," the man said, his gray flat-top haircut sparkling in the sun just as much as the giant, jagged combat knife that was shoved into its scabbard over the left side of his chest. "Hello," James responded, not sure if he should dare to shake the man's hand or not. The man's muscles looked so large that he'd probably break his claws if he tried. "This way," the soldier said, putting on his red hat. Following the man, James picked up on the occasional whisper between him and Anna Sophia, something about leaving unannounced and turning back. Walking into a nearby building, they passed a small desk. James noticed the soldiers watching the computer screens, stopping their work and staring as they walked past. Their eyes told a greater story than any novel ever could, making James wonder how long the fighting had been going on. Something else to ask Miss Houston, if she was still alive. Passing by some doorways, the three stepped into a room labeled Scheduling. After ducking down to fit through the doorway, James spotted a familiar face seated across the table. "What did you do to yourself?" Miss Houston asked, brushing her hair out of her face and revealing a few bandages. "Oh, James said, narrowing his eyes and scratching the back of his head. "Just fighting for peace, justice, and the American way." "You've done a lousy job of it then, sir," Anna Sophia said, floating past him and sitting on the right side of the table. After nodding, everyone except James took a seat. "Excuse me?" James wanted to ask. "Mr. Russo will be here once he's done," Anna Sophia said, grabbing some papers and pushing them across the table. "Until then, this is the briefest version of where this all started." He made it, James thought in relief. If Mr. Russo had pulled through, then perhaps Maurice had as well. Gazing at the desk, he could see a layout of what looked like an upside-down United States of America. In fact, it looked like everything was upside down, with what resembled Canada on the bottom and Mexico going north. As you can see, the assaults became organized once they reached Point E, Anna Sophia said, tapping on her copy of the map. It looked like she was pointing at where upside-down Rhode Island was. From here, the enemy joined other organized rebel protest groups, converging on the White House as an organized armed force. "Do we know what they want yet?" Miss Houston asked, sounding more militant than James had ever heard her speak before. "Besides complete control?" Anna Sophia said, shaking her head. "Not yet." With that, everyone looked up from the paper at James. A feeling of dread fell over him, down to the edges of his fangs. He prayed that they weren't blaming all of this on him. "What did I do?" James said, immediately regretting asking. "That's what we'd like to know," Miss Houston said, leaning back in her chair and folding her fingers over one another. "You have the distinct aura of young Mr. James." "Yeah, so?" James asked, feeling more confused. "Trolls can obtain the auras of anyone they consume," Anna Sophia said, folding her arms, "as well as shapeshift into them. We learned that one Mrs. Patricia Pierce was consumed and impersonated. So if you ate... No, it's really me," James said, horrified that anyone could think of him as just a troll. "Ask Maurice. He was there. My body was..." He felt the horrible memory of his broken and bleeding frame trapped beneath the rubble float to the forefront of his mind. "And then there's security detail Maurice," Miss Houston said, standing up from her seat and leaning against the table. "Currently in critical condition, nearly burnt away by flames that reek of troll, sir." James shivered at the way she'd addressed him. It felt like they were putting on a similar performance to the one he'd put on for the monsters, but with much fewer references and way more potential prison time. "Well, I guess I technically burned him a little," but James started to say. The soldier slammed his knife into the table, making James jump and stab the low-hanging ceiling with his horns. He stared back at the man, reminded of the second-to-last panel of a certain meme that always ended in someone being thrown out of a window. I was trying to save us. What do you want from me? James asked, sounding more like he was begging than asking. Do you have any definitive proof that you are somehow James Rita? Miss Houston asked. Because if you're not... She trailed off, allowing the intense gaze of the soldier to start to thicken the air around them. James didn't see any magical, sparkly stuff coming off of him, but somehow he didn't think Discount Arnold here needed it. There was a gun, or a thing that looked like a gun, James sputtered, brushing the dust from the ceiling off of his shoulders. I tried to use it to save us, but when I fired it, sir, Anna Sophia said, finally standing up from her spot at the table. Her eyes flashed as she narrowed her gaze at him. What on earth does gun thing mean? James felt his fangs twitch over his lower jaw. This was not going according to plan. He'd have to find some other way to prove he was just who Miss Houston claimed, the young man meant to be their next president. James started to wonder, what was something he wanted to do? Was that something he wanted to do? Maybe if he stuck to this troll thing, he could have his own adventure saving the country. There's got to be a ton to explore without all the responsibility of being in charge. His brief adventure thus far seemed to fly by as one large ongoing flashback. The moments in the Oval Office, traveling around the White House, being locked away, discovering the IGs for the first time, the betrayal. What had it all been for? Was it even worth pursuing? Looking up from his thoughts, James saw the soldier clenching the hilt of his knife, as if about to tear it free and leap across at him. On top of that, Miss Houston and Anna Sophia were both surrounded by glowing magical trails of purple and orange. They swirled around them as Anna Sophia raised an eyebrow at him. Are you surrendering? They silently challenged him. Thoughts of the hero's journey flashed across James's memory. Everything from choosing friends over obtaining treasure to giving in to the promise of endless power passed by his vision. Each failure and success of characters he'd idolized all played before him, just as exciting as before. Except this time, it was real. If he didn't prove his innocence right here, his journey could end right now. To make it even worse, Maurice would be just the first of many individuals to suffer because of his actions. More soldiers would faint on the runway, and more than just the White House would be ruined. Then again, James knew escape was an option. It would be easy. All he'd have to do was use his firearm and eventually transform into one of the soldiers outside. It would be gruesome, but plenty of heroes had to make difficult decisions in the name of survival. Plus, he could later find some magical thing that could not only change him back, but also send him home. He'd never have to look back. He'd never have to worry about being president of anything ever again. It would be easy. Is that who I am? James wondered, looking at his claws. Do I want to just run away again? He remembered the closet, and how much it stunk. He was no hero. He was just a random college kid. He just wanted to be left alone, didn't he? A new thought started to seep into his mind. Something that seemed to make the tense feeling around him feel even colder. Looking back at the soldier, Miss Houston, and Anna Sophia, James realized the truth. As strong as these people were, as great as their power and influence must have been, they were just as helpless and scared as he was. Scared of a few monsters that had gained enough power to attack their nation's capital. To James, none of it was really that jarring, as this wasn't his home. If this had happened in the real world, he knew he would be beyond terrified. Their world is falling apart around them, he thought, and they need my help fixing it. Are you really capable of being that leader? The voice in the back of his mind jeered. Are you sure you don't just want to go it on your own? The question hung in his mind as the room stayed perfectly still. Moments passed. No one moved. It felt like the air itself had frozen over, waiting for a response. After a moment or two, James stepped up. I finished my acceptance speech, he said, the air warming slightly as he looked around. Miss Houston raised an eyebrow. James could clearly see her magic swirls start to die down a little. Have you now? She asked. Yes, ma'am, I have, he said, his voice steady. The images of Maurice, Mr. Russo, and the wounded soldier moved across his mind. And if you're okay with it, I'd like to share a small excerpt with all of you now. With her orange aura also beginning to die down, Anna Sophia briefly gazed at the soldier, a look passing between them. It's working, James thought, as he saw the flaring orange swirls in the air begin to die down around the fairy, her demeanor staying on alert as she carefully sat back down. The soldier, meanwhile, kept his hand on his blade. Make this quick, Miss Houston said, tapping on her clipboard. I will, ma'am, James said, taking a deep breath. He looked briefly at his claws, calmly resting them on the shiny surface of the table and nearly reaching the middle. They felt so unfamiliar to him, like a book he'd picked up and hadn't planned on reading. Yet here he was, at the metaphorical ending to its opening chapter, and there were so many questions left unanswered. This has to work, he thought, looking across the table at the three people staring at him. This needed to count. Recalling what he'd written back in the holding cell, James felt his heart swell as he realized how much he could do to help these people. He wanted to be a part of their story, to finally be free of his own concrete prison that he'd been reveling in since getting to college. It was time to go outside, time to step out, to touch the grass. It was time to help, just like the heroes he'd always looked up to always did. It was time to be a hero himself, as much as he could be at least. To the people of this great nation, James began, each word feeling natural, as though he'd practiced saying it 1,000,000 times before. I admit the world we live in is not a perfect one. Trials come to everyone, regardless of their upbringing and background. So do blessings. I truly believe all can enjoy the benefits of freedom here, but only if we unite as one nation under God. He paused, taking a deep breath. The America I hail from is not that different from this one. My own father, despite coming from another country, found great success starting his own business in the United States. Opportunities and freedoms he wouldn't have enjoyed elsewhere were present in America. And despite the difficulty and language barriers, he came to love his new home and raised a great family there. It was here, in America, that my father proved to me that anyone can be a hero. Stopping again, James saw Anna Sophia tilt her head to the left slightly. He gulped, hoping what he said was making sense. If there's one thing I've learned since living in this great country, it's this. America's heritage is one of freedom. Dragons and mobs may assault us and burn our homes, but they cannot destroy the pursuit of happiness and manifest destiny. Miss Houston seemed to squirm a little in her chair. James felt all the emotion he had built up start to fade. Was none of this landing with any of them? No matter where they come from, we will face the monsters that are at our door. We will celebrate our Independence Day, and we will not forget the Alamo, James said, deciding it was more important to be himself than to pretend to be someone who hadn't spent 3 days writing down every reference he could think of and then calling them all his acceptance speech. I know the future remains uncertain, but together we can reclaim our homes from those who seek to destroy us. Dang it, we're Americans. We will tear down this wall. We will choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it is hard. And, Mr. James, what in the name of my Aunt Susie are you even saying? Anna Sophia asked, the edge of her lip trembling. Well, I'm convinced, Miss Houston said, looking from James to the papers in front of her. Was that a chuckle? As am I, Anna Sophia said, the slightest hint of a smile on the edges of her face. What about you, Sergeant? Taking a better look, James could tell the two women were both on the verge of laughter. It almost hurt his feelings until he remembered that only part of what he'd said was something he'd legitimately say in an address to the country. Disrupting his thoughts, The soldier grabbed his knife and pulled it free of the table so easily, it made James wonder if it had even been stuck in the first place. Without saying a word, the muscular man with flat top hair put his knife back and gave the tiniest of nods. "Thank you, as always, Sergeant Marbo," Miss Houston said as the soldier walked around her chair and out the door. Finally learned his name, James thought, wondering why Marbo sounded so familiar to him. "I'd heard our next president was unique," Anna Sophia said, standing back up. "But I'd be lying if I said President Troll had ever crossed my mind." President Troll. James could get used to hearing that. "Once Maurice returns to full health, we'll get a full rundown of what exactly happened," Miss Houston said. "About that," James asked, not wanting to bring it up. "Is there any way you guys could turn me back into a human?" "If a solution is found, we will discuss it with you," Miss Houston said, walking up to James and tapping his elbow. "For now, this may be more beneficial for us than you might think." How so? He thought. He stared at the witch, noticing more wrinkles around her eyes than the last time he'd seen her. It almost looked like she'd gotten a couple years older. "Indeed," Anna Sophia said, also getting up and folding her arms. "This will be the first time we've ever had a troll fill the presidential seat." "But I'm not a real troll," James said, as if it were a matter of fact. "Clearly," Miss Houston agreed. "But your new form might prove useful as this conflict escalates." Strong leaders inspire strong people, and the country needs strong people now more than ever, Anna Sophia said, using her wings and floating around him. "With a troll in the presidential seat, leading the charge against those who sought to destroy America, why, such an individual could be amongst our enemies even now," Miss Houston mentioned. "It'd be the perfect disguise." "Aren't there spells or something that can do that?" James asked. "Good heavens, no," Miss Houston chuckled, making his skin crawl. "Such magic is a myth, just like teleportation or time travel." To say James was disappointed would be an insult to disappointed college students everywhere. "Then what are we going to do?" James asked. A gentle hand reached under his arm and held him comfortingly. Looking down, he noticed Anna Sophia smiling for the first time since they'd met. "For starters, let's get a ghostwriter on that acceptance speech," she said. "Once we finalize that, we'll look into ways to get you back to normal." "We've also got a country to retake," Miss Houston said, recomposing herself. "This attack was well coordinated and perfectly executed. Whatever's behind this needs to be stopped." Sure, that made sense, but James still couldn't believe it. He was stuck as a troll, and he was still becoming the president. It all sounded so ridiculous. It could have been a modern fairy tale written by some hot guy in a single week. "Whatever happens, you won't be alone," Miss Houston said. Anna Sophia nodded, retracting her arm as the light from the room seemed to shine down on the three of them like a spotlight over a stage performer. "I'm gonna need you," James sighed, his shoulders sagging as he wondered where on earth he'd be sleeping from now on. Without warning, the door opened behind them, drawing everyone's attention. As James moved his large frame around, he heard a familiar voice ring out, loud and clear. "Holy crap, is that a dragon, dude? Bro, shut up, we're in so much trouble." "Secretary," Sergeant Marbo said, dragging someone in the room. "New arrivals." James's breath caught in his throat. There was no way, no chance in all the worlds that ever were that who he thought was here was actually here. After everything that had happened, there was no possible way this universe would throw such a ridiculous curveball at him in the 11th hour. "No offense, mister, but you really need a bath," Mace said as Charlie wrinkled his nose.